When a mother's last 7 cents stood between her child and death, an entire town turned their backs, until one man's tears changed everything. This is the story of Sarah Whitfield, a widow who faced the cruelest judgment, and Ethan Mallory, the rancher whose broken heart still had room for mercy. What happened next shook Silverton, Kansas to its core. Stay with me until the end, and comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The Kansas wind carried dust and judgment in equal measure through the streets of Silverton that November morning in 1881. Sarah Whitfield stood at the counter of Morrison's General Store, her daughter Grace limp in her arms, and felt the weight of every eye upon her like stones ready to be thrown. 5 days. 5 days since Grace had eaten anything more than rainwater Sarah had caught in her cupped palms. 5 days since the little girl's cries for food had faded to whimpers, then to terrible, hollow silence. Now, at 4 years old, Grace simply hung against her mother's shoulder, her breathing shallow, her lips cracked and colorless. Sarah's fingers trembled as she counted out the coins one more time on the scarred wooden counter. 3 pennies. 4. 7 cents total. Everything left in this world between her child and starvation. "Please," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the whisper of fabric as the other customers shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to watch. "Just a little milk. Anything. She hasn't—" "7 cents don't buy nothing here, Mrs. Whitfield." Jonas Morrison's voice cut through the store like an axe through kindling. He was a thick man with a face like a closed fist, and his eyes held no mercy. "This ain't no charity house." Sarah's vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. Not here. Not in front of these people who had once smiled at her, once called her neighbor, once brought covered dishes when her husband Thomas died in the mine collapse 2 years ago. Now they looked at her like something diseased, something shameful. "I'll work," Sarah said, hating the desperation that crept into her voice. "I'll scrub your floors, wash your windows, anything. We got no use for the likes of you." This came from Margaret Pruitt, the banker's wife, her considerable bulk encased in burgundy silk that whispered with every breath. "Decent women find ways to provide. My Herald says you've had 2 years to get yourself situated. 2 years of refusing honest proposals, refusing proper work. I've taken every job offered," Sarah said, her voice stronger now, anger burning through the fog of exhaustion. "But when Mr. Carson discovered I wouldn't do what he wanted in addition to the cleaning, he dismissed me. When Reverend Foster's wife heard I was working at the saloon, just washing glasses, nothing more, she made sure I was fired. Every time I find work, someone decides I'm not worthy of it." "Maybe you ain't," came a voice from the corner. Silas Blackwood, the deputy sheriff, stepped forward with the slow, deliberate menace of a man who enjoyed his power. "Maybe that child would be better off in the county home. Fed regular, clothed proper, away from a mother who can't, or won't, provide." Sarah's arms tightened around Grace instinctively. The little girl stirred slightly, a small sound escaping her lips. Not quite a cry, more like the ghost of one. It was that sound, that tiny evidence of life still flickering in her baby's body, that nearly broke Sarah completely. "You won't take her!" The words came out fierce, final. "I'll die before I let you put my daughter in that place." Sarah knew what the county home was. Everyone knew. A warehouse for unwanted children where illness spread like wildfire, where small bodies were worked until they broke, where children went in with names and came out as numbers, if they came out at all. "That can be arranged." Silas smiled, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "You're clearly unfit. Letting a child starve. Judge Morrison, Jonas's brother, would sign the papers today." The store had gone absolutely silent. Even the clock on the wall seemed to hold its breath. Sarah felt the world narrowing to a single point of white-hot desperation. She had nothing left to bargain with. No money, no friends, no options. She looked down at Grace's face, so pale it was almost translucent, the delicate blue veins visible beneath skin that had once been rosy with health. Her daughter's eyes were closed, her breathing barely perceptible. 5 days was too long. Far too long. "God," Sarah breathed, not even sure if it was a prayer or just a word torn from the depths of her soul. "Please." The door opened. The bell above it should have made its usual cheerful jingle, but somehow the sound seemed muted, as if the very air had changed. A gust of cold November wind swept through the store, carrying the scent of leather and horses and open prairie. Every head turned. The man who filled the doorway was tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders that seemed to block out the morning light. He wore a long duster coat darkened with trail dust, and his hat sat low over the eyes that, when he lifted his head, were the color of storm clouds over the plains. Ethan Mallory. Even Sarah, isolated as she'd been by poverty and shame, knew that name. The Mallory Ranch sprawled across the northern territory like a kingdom, thousands of acres of prime grazing land. Ethan Mallory was spoken of in whispers, a man who'd built an empire with his bare hands, who employed half the county, whose word could make or break men. He was also a man who hadn't been seen in Silverton proper for 3 years, not since the fire. The silence in the store took on a different quality now, charged with a tension that had nothing to do with Sarah's desperation and everything to do with the walking legend who'd just crossed the threshold. Ethan's gaze swept the room with the careful attention of a man used to reading terrain and threat in equal measure. It passed over Morrison, over Margaret Pruitt's shocked face, over Silas Blackwood's narrowing eyes. Then it landed on Sarah, and something in those storm-gray eyes shifted. He saw Grace. Sarah watched as Ethan Mallory, this man of stone and legend, went absolutely still. His jaw clenched. His hands, which had been loose at his sides, slowly curled into fists. He took one step forward, then another, his boots loud on the wooden floor. When he spoke, his voice was low, rough, like gravel grinding underfoot. "How long?" Sarah didn't pretend to misunderstand. 5 days, she whispered. 5 days without food. Something happened to Ethan Mallory's face then. The hardness cracked, just for a moment, and beneath it Sarah saw something raw and wounded and utterly human. His eyes, fixed on Grace's small, still form, began to glisten. The store held its collective breath. A single tear tracked down Ethan Mallory's weathered cheek. "Christ," he breathed. Then louder, his voice cracking like a whip. "Morrison!" Jonas Morrison actually jumped. "Mr. Mallory, sir, everything this child needs." Ethan's hand went to his coat, pulled out a leather wallet thick with bills. He slammed it on the counter hard enough to rattle the jars of penny candy. "Food, medicine, blankets, milk, now." "Sir, I don't think," Morrison began, but Ethan cut him off with a look that could have melted iron. "I don't recall asking you to think. I said now." Morrison scrambled to obey, his hands shaking as he reached for supplies. Margaret Pruitt made a sound of protest, but Ethan turned that same scorching gaze on her, and she swallowed whatever words she'd been preparing. Ethan moved to Sarah then, close enough that she could see the lines etched deep around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair. Up close, he was even more imposing, but something in his expression, that terrible, understanding grief, made Sarah's throat tighten. "May I?" he asked quietly, nodding toward Grace. Sarah hesitated only a moment before nodding. Ethan's hands, large and calloused from years of ranch work, were impossibly gentle as he took the little girl from her mother's arms. He cradled Grace against his chest with the practiced ease of a man who had once held a child before, and Sarah saw his throat work as he swallowed hard. Morrison returned with a bottle of fresh milk, his face flushed with confusion and something that might have been shame. Ethan took it with one hand, somehow managing to keep Grace secure with the other. He uncorked the bottle and carefully, so carefully, tipped it to the child's cracked lips. "Come on, little one," he murmured, his voice dropping to something soft, almost tender. "Just a little. That's all I'm asking. Just a little." For a heartbreaking moment, nothing happened. Grace's lips remained slack, unresponsive. Sarah felt her heart stutter in her chest. Was it too late? Had she waited too long, failed too completely? Then Grace's lips moved. Just barely, just enough to let a few drops of milk pass. Her throat worked in a weak swallow. "That's it," Ethan breathed, and Sarah heard the relief in his voice like a prayer answered. "That's my girl. A little more now." Grace took another swallow, then another. Color, just the faintest hint of it, began to return to her cheeks, Her eyelids fluttered. Sarah pressed her hand to her mouth, choking back a sob. Around them, the store remained frozen, every person transfixed by the sight of the legendary Ethan Mallory, tears streaming freely down his face now, coaxing a dying child back to life with milk and whispered encouragement. "Mama?" The word was barely audible, just a breath of sound, but it was Grace's voice. Her eyes opened, those beautiful brown eyes that were so like her father's, and found Sarah's face. "I'm here, baby," Sarah whispered. "Mama's right here." Ethan kept the bottle steady, letting Grace drink at her own pace. "Not too much at once," he said, as much to himself as to anyone else. "Small amounts. Don't want to make her sick." He seemed to know what he was doing, Sarah realized. This wasn't just compassion, it was experience, the knowledge of someone who had once cared for a small child. When Grace had taken about a quarter of the bottle, Ethan gently pulled it away despite her small sound of protest. "More in a little while, sweetheart. Let that settle first." He looked at Morrison, who still stood behind the counter as if rooted to the spot. "Bread, fresh, and some of that chicken broth Mrs. Morrison keeps in the back." "Yes, sir. Right away, sir." As Morrison scurried off, Ethan turned his attention back to Sarah. "What's your name?" "Sarah. Sarah Whitfield." She hesitated. "This is Grace." "Grace." Ethan's expression softened further as he looked down at the child in his arms. "Beautiful name for a beautiful girl." He paused, seemed to steel himself, then met Sarah's eyes directly. "What happened to bring you to this?" The question wasn't accusatory. It was simple, direct, the question of a man who wanted to understand. Sarah felt the now familiar burn of shame creep up her neck, but something in Ethan's face, that grief-touched understanding, made her answer honestly. "My husband died 2 years ago. Mine collapsed. I tried to keep our home, tried to find work, but—" She glanced around at the watching faces, each one carved with varying degrees of judgment. "Decent work is hard to come by for a woman alone. The kind I could find, the kind they'd let me keep. Barely paid enough for rent, let alone food. Then even that dried up. 3 weeks ago we were evicted. We've been sleeping in the old barn at the edge of town, and the work, it just stopped." "Because of men like Carson," Ethan said flatly. Sarah's eyes widened. "I know plenty about what goes on in this town." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I know about men who think a widow is fair game. I know about women who'd rather see a child starve than let her mother work in a saloon, even doing honest labor. I know about all of it." Silas Blackwood chose that moment to insert himself back into the conversation. "Now see here, Mallory, we was just about to take the child into protective custody. The mother here has proven she can't provide basics." Ethan turned to look at the deputy, and whatever Silas saw in his face made the words die in his throat. "You were about to do what?" "The county home," Silas said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "For the child's own good." "The county home," Ethan repeated the words as if tasting something foul. "That death trap where children go to waste away? That place? It's better than starving." "Is it?" Ethan's voice dropped to something dangerous. "Tell me, Silas, when was the last time you actually visited the county home? Saw the conditions? Counted how many children make it out alive?" Silas's face reddened. "That ain't the point." "That's exactly the point." Ethan shifted Grace carefully in his arms, making sure she remained comfortable. "This child has a mother who loves her, a mother who's been systematically denied the ability to provide by every supposed pillar of this community. And your solution is to tear them apart?" Margaret Pruitt found her voice again, shrill with indignation. "Well, what would you have us do? We can't all just throw money at every unfortunate—" "You could try basic human decency," Ethan said, and the contempt in his voice was withering. "You could try remembering that Sarah Whitfield's husband died putting food on your tables, keeping coal in your stoves. Thomas Whitfield was a good man who worked himself to death in those mines. This is how you honor his memory? By letting his widow and child starve?" The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah felt tears streaming down her own face now, hearing her Thomas defended, hearing someone finally speak the truth that everyone else had been so eager to forget. Morrison returned with the bread and broth, setting them on the counter with shaking hands. Ethan nodded toward them. "Pack those up." Add a week's worth of supplies. Good supplies. Meat, vegetables, flour, sugar, coffee. Everything a family needs. Mr. Mallory, the cost? I don't care about the cost. Ethan's voice was flat, final. Pack it, now. As Morrison scrambled to obey, Ethan looked down at Grace again. She was more alert now, her eyes tracking movement, her fingers curling weakly against his coat. "You're going to be all right, little one," he murmured. "I promise you that." Then he raised his eyes to Sarah, and what she saw in them made her breath catch. There was determination there, yes, but also something else. Something that looked almost like hope. Desperate, fragile hope in the eyes of a man who'd clearly lost it long ago. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, his voice formal but not unkind. "I have a proposition for you." Sarah's heart stuttered. She'd heard that word before, that tone, from men whose propositions came with prices she couldn't pay. Her hand instinctively reached for Grace, ready to take her daughter and run if necessary, 7 cents and dignity be damned. Ethan must have seen the fear flash across her face because he shook his head quickly. "Not that kind of proposition. Nothing. Improper. I'm talking about honest work, honest wages, and a safe place for you and Grace to live." "I don't understand," Sarah whispered. "My ranch." Ethan seemed to be choosing his words carefully, as if each one cost him something. "It's big. Too big for one man. I need help. A housekeeper, someone to cook, clean, manage the household. The work is hard, but the pay is fair, room and board included. A safe, warm place for both of you." Sarah stared at him, afraid to believe, afraid to hope. "Why?" The word came out broken. "Why would you help us? You don't even know us." Something flickered in Ethan's eyes, pain, old and deep. He looked down at Grace again, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion, barely contained. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything. Because I know what it's like to be helpless when someone you love is suffering, and because—" He swallowed hard. "Because I couldn't save my own little girl when she needed me. But maybe I can save this one." The words hung in the air like a confession, like a wound torn open. Sarah saw the truth of them written in every line of Ethan Mallory's face, in the tears that still tracked down his weathered cheeks, in the way he held Grace as if she were made of spun glass. He had lost a daughter. That's what the whispers had been about, the tragedy that had made him disappear from town 3 years ago. He'd had a family, and he'd lost them. And the pain of it was still so fresh, so raw, that the sight of a starving child had brought him to tears in a room full of people. "The fire," Sarah breathed, understanding flooding through her. "Everyone talks about the fire, but no one says, 'my wife and daughter.'" Ethan's voice was barely above a whisper. 3 years ago. I was away, checking the northern fence line. By the time I got back—" He stopped, unable to continue. He didn't need to. Sarah could see the rest written in his eyes, the horror, the guilt, the unending grief of a man who'd arrived too late. Around them, the store remained silent. Even Margaret Pruitt had the grace to look uncomfortable now, her righteous anger deflated in the face of such raw suffering. Ethan cleared his throat, visibly pulling himself together. "The house is still there, still furnished. There's a room that would be perfect for Grace. If you want it, if you'll take the job." "The job," Sarah repeated slowly, still afraid this was some kind of cruel dream, that she'd wake up in the cold barn with Grace dying in her arms. $50 a month, Ethan said, and Sarah gasped. It was more than twice what she'd made at her best job, the one at the hotel before the manager's wife had her fired for being too pretty around the male guests. Plus room and board. You'd have your own quarters. Grace would have a proper bed, proper meals. There's a schoolhouse about 3 miles south. I'd make sure she could attend when she's well enough. Sarah's mind was reeling. It was too much, too good. There had to be a catch. There was always a catch. "What do you expect in return?" Ethan met her eyes steadily. "Honest work. Nothing more. I'm not asking for—" He paused, seemed to choose his words carefully. "I'm not looking for a wife, Mrs. Whitfield. I'm not looking for companionship of that nature. I just need help managing a house that's too full of ghosts, and you need a safe place for your daughter. It's a business arrangement. Nothing more. Sarah searched his face for any sign of deception, any hint of the darkness she'd learned to watch for in men's eyes. She found none, just grief and determination, and that fragile hope that seemed to hurt him as much as it sustained him. "Why now?" she asked. "You've been gone from town for 3 years. Why come back today?" Ethan glanced around the store, at the faces still watching with varying degrees of shock and judgment. "I had business with the land office, legal matters. I'd planned to be in and out without," he gestured vaguely, "without all this. But then I walked in here and saw—" His eyes dropped to Grace again. "I saw a little girl dying while people watched. I can't—" He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Sarah understood. He couldn't watch another child die. Not when he had the power to prevent it. Not when the guilt of his own daughter's death still consumed him. Sarah looked at Grace, really looked at her. The little girl's eyes were clear now, focused on Ethan's face with something like trust. She'd taken more milk, was breathing easier. Already, in just these few minutes, she looked more alive than she had in days. What choice did Sarah really have? Stay in Silverton, where every door was closed to her? Try to survive another week on nothing, watching her daughter waste away? Or take a chance on this broken man who'd shown her more kindness in 10 minutes than the whole town had in 2 years? "I'll take the job," Sarah said, and heard the finality in her own voice. "I'll work hard. I'll earn every penny. I promise you that." Ethan's shoulders sagged slightly, as if he'd been holding tension he could finally release. "Thank you," he said, and the gratitude in his voice was real, as if she were doing him the favor, not the other way around. Morrison approached with a large crate filled to brimming with supplies, more food than Sarah had seen in months. His face was carefully neutral now, all earlier hostility buried under the weight of Ethan Mallory's disapproval. Ethan shifted Grace carefully, preparing to hand her back to Sarah. But the little girl made a small sound of protest, her tiny fingers clutching at his coat. He froze, looking down at her with an expression of such profound pain and longing that Sarah had to look away from the intimacy of it. "It's all right, sweetheart," Ethan murmured to Grace. "I'm going to get you home, going to get you safe. I promise." He looked at Sarah. "My wagon's outside. I'll load the supplies, then we'll head to the ranch. It's about an hour's ride north. Think Grace can manage it?" "I think she can manage anything now," Sarah said softly, "thanks to you." Ethan shook his head. "Don't thank me yet. Wait until you've seen the house. It's not what it once was. I haven't been able to bring myself to change anything since—" Again, he couldn't finish. Didn't need to. As they prepared to leave, Silas Blackwood stepped forward one more time, his face tight with poorly concealed anger. "This ain't proper, Mallory. A single man and a widow living under the same roof? The talk alone—" "The talk," Ethan said, his voice dropping to something dangerous again, "will be that Ethan Mallory hired a housekeeper and saved a child's life. Anyone who says different will answer to me personally. Are we clear, Silas?" The deputy swallowed hard, clearly wanting to argue, but not quite daring to. "Judge Morrison ain't going to like this. Judge Morrison can take his objections up with me directly." Ethan settled his hat more firmly on his head. "He knows where to find me. Though I'd remind him that the Mallory Ranch employs about 40 men who depend on me for their livelihoods. Men who vote. Men who might be interested to hear how the good judge's brother tried to let a child starve rather than extend 7 cents worth of credit." Morrison's face went white. Margaret Pruitt looked as if she'd swallowed something sour. Even Silas seemed to recognize he was outmatched. Ethan turned his back on them all, Grace still cradled against his chest, and headed for the door. Sarah followed, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and hope, so intense it made her dizzy. At the threshold, Ethan paused and looked back at the assembled townspeople. His eyes swept over each face, and Sarah saw them flinch under that gaze. Saw the shame, the discomfort, the recognition of their own cruelty reflected back at them. "You should all be ashamed," Ethan said quietly. "Every last one of you." Then he walked out into the November morning, carrying a dying child toward salvation, and Sarah Whitfield followed him toward a future she never could have imagined. The wagon was exactly where Ethan had said it would be, hitched to 2 strong horses that stamped impatiently in the cold. He settled Grace on the bench seat with infinite care. wrapping her in his own coat despite Sarah's protests. "I've got another in the wagon bed," he said, already moving to load the supplies Morrison had hastily packed. "She needs it more than I do." Sarah climbed up beside Grace, pulling her daughter close. The little girl was already drowsier, the milk and warmth combining to pull her toward real sleep, the first peaceful sleep she'd had in days. Sarah stroked her hair, barely able to process what had just happened. Ethan swung up onto the driver's seat, took up the reins and clicked his tongue to the horses. The wagon lurched into motion, carrying them away from Silverton, away from judgment and starvation and despair. As the town fell behind them, Sarah finally allowed herself to cry, great shaking sobs of relief and fear and overwhelming gratitude. She'd been so close to losing everything, so close to watching Grace slip away into death. And now, because one man's grief had cracked open at precisely the right moment, they had a chance. A real chance. Ethan said nothing about her tears. He just drove, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his jaw tight. But after a moment, Sarah saw his hand reach out and very gently, very carefully, touch Grace's small foot where it peeked out from beneath his coat. Just a touch, barely there, as if he needed to reassure himself she was real, she was alive, she was safe. They rode north across the Kansas prairie, the winter's grass golden in the slanting light. Three broken souls bound together by circumstance and mercy and the desperate, fragile possibility of redemption. The Mallory Ranch appeared on the horizon like a mirage. Sarah had heard tales of its size, but nothing had prepared her for the reality. The main house sat on a rise, a sprawling two-story structure of white-painted wood with a wide porch that wrapped around three sides. Behind it, she could see barns, bunkhouses, corrals, a whole community built by one man's ambition and will. But as they drew closer, Sarah began to see the truth beneath the impressive facade. The paint was peeling. Weeds grew wild in what had once been flower beds. One of the porch railings hung at an odd angle, clearly broken and never repaired. The whole place had an air of neglect, of abandonment, as if the man who owned it had simply stopped caring 3 years ago and never started again. Ethan pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and sat for a long moment, his hands tight on the reins, his shoulders rigid. Sarah realized with a start that he was afraid. This man who'd faced down a hostile town without flinching was terrified of his own home. "I haven't been inside since the day after," he said quietly. "I sleep in the bunkhouse with the men. Take my meals in the cookhouse. The foreman, Jack Reeves, has keys, checks on things, but nobody goes in unless absolutely necessary. The men, they understand." Sarah looked at the house and saw it for what it was. A mausoleum. A shrine to the dead, preserved exactly as it had been in the moment Ethan's world had ended. No wonder he couldn't bear to enter it. "Maybe it's time," she said softly. Ethan's laugh was bitter. Time. As if 3 years is enough. As if 100 years would be enough. "I didn't mean time to forget," Sarah clarified. "I meant time to remember differently. Time to let the house be something other than the place where you lost them." Ethan turned to look at her, something unreadable in his storm-gray eyes. "You sound like you understand." "I've spent 2 years living in the shadow of my husband's death," Sarah said. 2 years when every moment was colored by loss. "I'm not saying I'm over it. I'll never be over it. But I've learned that we can honor the dead without dying ourselves. Thomas would have hated seeing what I became. What I let happen to Grace because I was so paralyzed by grief I couldn't see clearly anymore. And you think my—" Ethan gestured toward the house. "You think my wife and daughter would hate this?" "I think they'd want you to live," Sarah said simply. "Really live. Not just exist." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then, moving as if every muscle hurt, he climbed down from the wagon. He came around to Sarah's side and carefully, gently lifted Grace into his arms. The little girl stirred but didn't wake, trusting this stranger completely in the way only children can. "Come on then," Ethan said, his voice rough. "Let's go inside." The front door stuck, the hinges protesting from disuse. When it finally opened, the smell of closed-up spaces and old grief washed over them. Ethan stood on the threshold, frozen, and Sarah saw his throat work as he swallowed hard. She stepped past him, taking the first step into his house, making it easier for him to follow. The interior was dim, curtains drawn against the light. But even in the shadows, Sarah could see the traces of the life that had once filled these rooms. A child's toy horse sat on a side table, frozen mid-gallop. A woman's shawl hung on a coat rack, as if waiting for her return. Photographs lined the walls, a beautiful woman with kind eyes, a little girl with dark curls, and her father's smile. Ethan's family. His lost loves. The fire started in the kitchen, Ethan said behind her, his voice hollow. Something with the stove. The smoke got them before... He stopped, cleared his throat. The house itself mostly survived. It was cleaned, repaired, but I couldn't change anything else. Couldn't move her things, couldn't put away Emma's toys. It felt like erasing them. It's not erasing them to live around their memory instead of in it, Sarah said gently. She moved further into the house, into what appeared to be a parlor. Everything was covered in dust, but beneath it she could see quality furniture, beautiful rugs, all the markers of a home built with love and care. Ethan followed, still carrying Grace. The bedrooms are upstairs. I thought, there's a room next to what used to be, next to Emma's room. It's smaller, but it has good light. For Grace. They climbed the stairs, each step seeming to cost Ethan something. At the top, a hallway stretched out, doors closed against the past. Ethan pushed open one door, then another. The second room was clearly the one he'd mentioned, smaller than the others, with windows facing east. A child's bed waited there, neatly made with a patchwork quilt that looked handmade. This was Emma's room, Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. She was 5 when it happened. Just a year older than Grace is now. He laid Grace carefully on the bed, tucking the quilt around her small form. His hand lingered on her hair, so similar to his daughter's, and Sarah saw the tears well in his eyes again. You don't have to decide everything today, Sarah said quietly. We'll take it slow, one day at a time. Ethan nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He stood looking down at Grace for a long moment, this child who was and wasn't his daughter, this unexpected chance at redemption sleeping peacefully in his dead child's bed. Finally, he turned away, scrubbing at his eyes with the back of his hand. Your room is across the hall. The master, my room, is at the end. I'll start bringing in the supplies. Get a fire going in the kitchen stove. We need to get some real food into Grace as soon as she wakes. He moved past Sarah, heading for the stairs, clearly needing to escape the weight of memory pressing down on him. Sarah let him go, understanding the need for space, for air, for distance from the ghosts that crowded every corner of this house. She looked around the room that would be Grace's, seeing the traces of another little girl everywhere. A doll on the shelf. A drawing tacked to the wall, childish but full of joy. A tiny pair of shoes lined up neatly by the wardrobe. This was where Ethan Mallory's heart had broken. This was where his world had ended. And now, by some strange twist of fate, it was where her daughter would heal, would grow, would live. Sarah sent up a silent prayer, to God, to Thomas, to the woman and child whose presence still filled this house, asking for guidance, for strength, for the wisdom to navigate this impossible situation with grace and care. From downstairs, she heard Ethan moving around, heard the thump of supply crates being brought in, heard the clatter of the stove being lit, sounds of life returning to a house that had been dead for 3 years. Sarah crossed to the window and looked out at the Kansas prairie stretching endlessly in all directions. Somewhere out there was Silverton, with its judgment and cruelty and closed doors. But here, in this house of grief and memory, there was something else, something fragile and tentative, but real. There was hope. Sarah turned back to Grace, still sleeping peacefully, color returning to her cheeks with each passing hour. Whatever happened next, whatever challenges awaited them in this strange arrangement, her daughter would live, would thrive. And that, Sarah thought, was worth any price, any risk, any fear. She heard Ethan's footsteps on the stairs again, heard him pause outside the door. Sarah? His voice was uncertain, as if he still couldn't quite believe she was here, that any of this was real. I'm here, she answered. I've got the stove going. Thought I'd make some broth, some soft bread, for when she wakes. That would be good. Thank you. Another pause, then, thank you for coming, for... for giving me a chance to make something right, even if I can never really make it right. Sarah moved to the doorway, looked at this man who'd saved her daughter's life, who'd offered them sanctuary when the whole world had turned its back. We're all just trying to make things right, Mr. Mallory. We're all just trying to survive our grief and find a reason to keep going. Maybe we can help each other do that. Ethan met her eyes, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something other than pain in his expression. Not happiness. It was too soon for that. Maybe too soon forever. But something lighter, something almost like peace. Maybe we can, he said. Then he turned and headed back downstairs, back to the kitchen where his wife and daughter had died, back to the heart of his grief. And Sarah heard him moving around down there, heard pots clanging, heard water running, heard the sounds of a man learning to live in his own home again. And in the bedroom that had once belonged to Emma Mallory, Grace stirred in her sleep and smiled. And Sarah Whitfield allowed herself to believe just for a moment that everything might actually be all right. The sun was setting over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and in the Mallory house, life, fragile, uncertain, but undeniably real, began again. The first week at the Mallory Ranch passed in a haze of careful routines and unspoken boundaries. Sarah moved through the house like a woman navigating a museum, acutely aware that every object held meaning, every room carried the weight of memory. She cleaned quietly, disturbing as little as possible, always conscious of the man who watched from doorways with haunted eyes, as if waiting for her to erase some crucial trace of the family he'd lost. Grace recovered with the resilience of the young. By the third day, she was sitting up, asking for food in her small, clear voice. By the fifth, she was walking the hallways, her hand clutched tight in Sarah's, her curious eyes taking in everything. And by the seventh day, she stood at the window of Emma's room, her room now, and asked the question Sarah had been dreading. "Mama, whose toys are these?" Sarah knelt beside her daughter, choosing her words carefully. "They belong to a little girl who lived here before us. Her name was Emma." "Where is she now?" "She's in heaven, sweetheart, with the angels." Grace considered this with the solemn acceptance of a child who'd already learned that the world could be cruel and unfair. "Like Papa." "Yes, baby, like Papa." "Is that why Mr. Ethan is so sad?" Sarah's throat tightened. She hadn't realized Grace had noticed, but children saw everything, didn't they? They understood more than adults ever gave them credit for. "Yes, Emma was his little girl. He misses her very much." Grace nodded slowly, then reached out and picked up the doll from the shelf, a beautiful china-faced thing with golden curls. She held it carefully, reverently. "Can I play with Emma's toys? Or would that make Mr. Ethan sadder?" The question, asked with such innocent wisdom, brought tears to Sarah's eyes. "I don't know, Grace. We'll have to ask him." But asking Ethan anything personal felt like stepping onto ice that might crack at any moment. He was unfailingly polite, almost formal. He ate the meals Sarah prepared with quiet gratitude, praised her cleaning, made sure they had everything they needed. But there was a distance to him, a careful wall he'd built between himself and any real connection. He slept in the bunkhouse still, took his coffee before dawn, and was gone to work the ranch before Sarah and Grace even woke. Sometimes Sarah would see him from the kitchen window, working with the horses in the corral, his movements efficient and practiced. Other times he'd be out on the range for days at a time, and the house would feel even emptier, even more like a tomb waiting for the dead to return. It was on one of those nights, with Ethan away checking the northern pastures and Grace asleep upstairs, that Sarah finally allowed herself to explore the house properly. She'd cleaned it, yes, but she'd been careful not to look too closely, not to pry. Now, alone with only the wind for company, she let herself really see. The parlor held a piano, dust-covered but clearly once loved. Sheet music sat on the stand, something called Jeannie with the light brown hair. Sarah touched the keys gently, and they responded with notes that were only slightly out of tune. Someone had played this often, kept it well-maintained. Ethan's wife, probably. Sarah had learned her name from the photographs. Catherine. Catherine Mallory, with her kind eyes and gentle smile. In the study, Sarah found books lined up on shelves, poetry, philosophy, novels. Some were clearly Catherine's, with a delicate handwriting in the margins. Others belonged to Ethan, his notes sharp and concise. They'd been readers, thinkers, an educated couple, cultured, building a life that was about more than just survival. And everywhere there were photographs. Catherine and Ethan on their wedding day, both so young, so full of hope. Catherine pregnant, glowing. Emma as a baby, as a toddler, growing into the beautiful child she'd been. The last photograph, the most recent, showed all three of them. Ethan with Emma on his shoulders, Catherine laughing at something off camera. They looked so happy, so whole. Sarah found herself standing in front of that photograph for a long time, studying Ethan's face. The man in the picture barely resembled the one she knew. That Ethan was lighter somehow, unweighted by grief. His smile reached his eyes. His shoulders didn't carry the burden of the world. That was taken about a month before the fire. Sarah spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Ethan stood in the doorway, his coat still dusty from travel, his face shadowed in the lamplight. She hadn't heard him come in. "I'm sorry," she stammered. "I didn't mean to pry. I was just—" "It's all right." He moved into the room, his eyes fixed on the photograph. "You live here now. You have a right to understand what you've walked into." He stood beside her, close enough that she could smell leather and prairie grass and the particular scent that was just him. They both looked at the photograph, at the ghost of the family that used to be. "Catherine took that photo to town to have it framed," Ethan said quietly. "As a surprise for my birthday. She and Emma were going to pick it up the day—" He stopped, swallowed. "The day it happened. But the framer wasn't finished, so they came home instead, and the stove—" His voice cracked. "If she'd just waited. If they'd just stayed in town another hour, they'd still be alive." Sarah's heart ached for him. "You can't think like that. You'll drive yourself mad with all the ifs." "I've been mad for 3 years," Ethan said. "One more layer won't make much difference." "Is that why you never come in the house? Why you sleep with the ranch hands instead of in your own bed?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "I can't sleep here. Every room has them in it. Every corner holds a memory. Catherine reading by the fire. Emma playing with her dolls on the stairs. The sound of Catherine's laugh. Emma calling for me." He pressed his palm against his eyes. "I hear them sometimes. I know they're not real, but I hear them anyway." Sarah reached out hesitantly and placed her hand on his arm. He flinched at the contact but didn't pull away. "Grief doesn't follow rules, Mr. Mallory. It doesn't have a timeline. You heal when you heal, not before." "And what if I never heal?" The question was raw, desperate. "What if this is all I am now? Just this broken thing that can't even walk into his own house without feeling like he's drowning?" "Then you learn to live with it," Sarah said firmly. "You learn to carry it without letting it carry you, and you accept help when it's offered." Ethan looked at her then, really looked at her, and Sarah saw the war in his eyes, the desire to accept comfort battling against the belief that he didn't deserve it, that he should suffer forever for his failure to save his family. "Grace asked about Emma's toys today," Sarah said, changing the subject slightly. "She wants to know if she can play with them." Ethan's expression shifted, something painful but almost hopeful flickering across his features. "She does. She's 4 years old. Toys are meant to be played with, but she wanted to make sure it wouldn't make you sad." "That child thinks about my feelings?" Ethan's voice was rough with emotion. "After everything she's been through, after nearly starving to death, she's worried about making me sad." "She's a good girl," Sarah said simply. "She has a kind heart." Ethan turned back to the photograph, his hands curling into fists at his sides. Emma would have wanted another child to play with her toys. She was generous like that, always sharing. Catherine used to say she had enough love for the whole world. He paused. "Tell Grace yes. Tell her she can play with anything she wants. Emma would have liked that." The permission seemed to cost him something, but there was relief in it too, as if he'd been waiting for a reason to let go, just a little, to allow the house to be something other than a shrine. "There's something else," Sarah ventured. "The ranch hands. I've seen them watching the house, watching us. They seem uncertain." Ethan sighed. "They're worried about me, about you, about what it means that I finally brought someone into the house." "What does it mean?" "I don't know yet," Ethan admitted. He looked exhausted suddenly, the weariness of 3 years of grief settling over him like a physical weight. I just know that when I saw Grace dying in your arms, something in me broke open. Or maybe it broke closed, I'm not sure. But I couldn't leave you there. I couldn't watch another child suffer when I had the power to help. You saved her life, Sarah said. You gave us both a future. That's not nothing. Isn't it? Ethan's smile was bitter. I'm not sure I saved you, Mrs. Whitfield. I might have just traded one prison for another. This house, this grief, it's a heavy burden to share. Heavier than starving in a barn? Sarah challenged. Heavier than watching my daughter die by inches? I'll take this burden, Mr. Mallory, gladly. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything unspoken hanging between them. Then Ethan cleared his throat. I should go. The bunkhouse, you could stay, Sarah said impulsively. In your own house, in your own bed. The guest room is ready if the master bedroom is too much. You don't have to keep punishing yourself. Ethan looked at her with such naked longing and fear that Sarah almost took the words back. I don't know if I can, he whispered. Then try, Sarah urged. Just for tonight. See if you can. Ethan stood frozen, clearly torn. Then, slowly, he nodded. All right, I'll try. He moved toward the stairs like a man walking to his execution, each step deliberate and pained. Sarah watched him go, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake, if pushing him would break whatever fragile peace he'd managed to build. But an hour later, when she checked on Grace one final time before bed, she saw light under Ethan's door at the end of the hall. He was still awake, still there. He'd stayed. It was a small victory, but Sarah had learned that in the landscape of grief, small victories were everything. The next morning, Sarah woke to the sound of voices downstairs. Men's voices, rough and concerned. She threw on her robe and hurried down to find 3 ranch hands standing in the kitchen, hats in hands, looking uncomfortable. Ethan stood by the stove, his face tight with barely controlled emotion. What's wrong? Sarah asked. The youngest of the men, a boy who couldn't be more than 19, turned to her with worried eyes. Sorry to disturb you, ma'am. We just came to check on the boss. When he didn't show up for morning briefing, we got concerned. He's never spent the night in the house before. Sarah looked at Ethan and saw the shame creeping up his neck, the way his hands trembled slightly as he gripped his coffee cup. These men had watched him fall apart 3 years ago. They'd witnessed his inability to face his own home, his nightly retreat to the bunkhouse. Now they'd found him here, and they didn't know what it meant. Mr. Mallory was working late on the ranch accounts, Sarah said smoothly, the lie coming easily. I insisted he take the guest room rather than walk all the way to the bunkhouse in the dark. He's not as young as you boys, after all. Ethan shot her a look that might have been gratitude or might have been annoyance. She couldn't quite tell. But the ranch hands seemed to accept the explanation, their shoulders relaxing slightly. Yes, ma'am, the oldest one said. He was a weathered man with kind eyes that looked at Ethan with something like paternal concern. Jack Reeves, ma'am. I'm the foreman here. Just wanted to make sure everything was all right. Everything's fine, Jack, Ethan said, his voice steadier now. I appreciate the concern, but as Mrs. Whitfield said, I just worked late. Jack's eyes flicked between them, clearly not entirely convinced, but he nodded. Yes, sir. We'll get back to it then. Got those horses to break in the south corral. As the men filed out, Sarah heard the youngest one whisper to Jack, Think he's finally coming back to himself? Jack's reply was too quiet for Sarah to hear, but she saw Ethan's shoulders stiffen, knew he'd caught it. The door closed behind them, and Ethan set down his coffee cup with a sharp click. You shouldn't have lied for me, he said. I didn't lie. You were working late, just not on ranch accounts. Sarah, Mrs. Whitfield, she corrected automatically, maintaining the formal distance he seemed to need. Ethan's expression softened slightly. You're trying to protect my pride in front of my own men. I'm trying to protect a good man who's been through hell, Sarah said. There's a difference. Before Ethan could respond, they heard small footsteps on the stairs. Grace appeared in the doorway, Emma's doll clutched in her arms, her hair still mussed from sleep. Good morning, sweetheart, Sarah said, moving to lift her daughter. But Grace surprised her by walking straight to Ethan instead. Mr. Ethan, she said in her small, clear voice. I'm playing with Emma's doll. Is that all right? Ethan froze, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. Sarah saw his throat work, saw the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Then slowly he knelt down to Grace's level, bringing himself eye to eye with the little girl. "What's her name?" he asked, his voice rough. "I don't know," Grace admitted. "What did Emma call her?" Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, they glistened with unshed tears. "Molly. Her name was Molly." Grace considered this seriously. "That's a good name. I'll take good care of Molly, Mr. Ethan. I promise." "I know you will, sweetheart." Ethan reached out and gently touched Grace's hair, the gesture so tender, so full of longing, that Sarah had to look away from the intimacy of it. Emma would be happy knowing Molly had a friend to play with again. Grace smiled, the first real smile Sarah had seen from her daughter in weeks, and threw her arms around Ethan's neck in an impulsive hug. Ethan stiffened in shock. Then, very slowly, his arms came up to return the embrace. He held Grace carefully, as if she might break, and Sarah saw a single tear track down his weathered cheek. When Grace pulled back, she studied Ethan's face with a child's brutal honesty. "You're sad like Mama," she observed. "But it's okay. Mama says being sad doesn't mean you can't be happy sometimes, too." Ethan looked up at Sarah over Grace's head, something raw and wondering in his expression. "Your mama is a very wise woman," he said. "I know," Grace agreed matter-of-factly. Then, with the quick attention span of the young, she was off, running back upstairs to play, Molly bouncing in her arms. The silence she left behind felt charged, weighted with too many emotions to name. Ethan stood slowly, turning away from Sarah, his hands gripping the edge of the kitchen counter. "She's so much like Emma," he said quietly. "The same age, the same curiosity, the same way of looking at the world like it's all new and wonderful despite everything she's been through." "Is that too hard?" Sarah asked gently. "Having her here?" "No." Ethan turned to face her, and Sarah saw the truth in his eyes. "No, it's like being given a second chance I never thought I'd have, a chance to protect a child, to give her the life Emma should have had." He paused. "Does that make me selfish? Using your daughter to heal my own wounds? Are you using her, or are you just loving her because she needs love and you have love to give?" Ethan seemed startled by the question. "I don't know if I have anything left to give, not after—" "You gave her milk when she was dying," Sarah interrupted. "You gave us both shelter when no one else would. You held her while she slept and you cried for her suffering. That's love, Mr. Mallory. Maybe broken love, maybe grief-stained love, but it's love nonetheless." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then, "My men are going to talk. Jack's already suspicious, and if they're talking, the town will hear. They'll say things about you, about us, about why a young widow is living in a widower's house." Sarah had been expecting this. She'd felt it coming like a storm on the horizon. "Let them talk. I've survived worse than gossip." "Have you?" Ethan's eyes were intense. "Because Silverton isn't kind to women they've decided are immoral. They'll make your life hell. They'll make sure Grace suffers for it too." "Then we'll deal with it," Sarah said, more confident than she felt. "Together." The word hung in the air between them. Together. As if they were a unit, a team, something more than employer and employee. Ethan heard it too, Sarah could tell by the way his expression shifted, became more guarded. "I should get to work," he said abruptly. "The horses won't break themselves." He grabbed his hat and coat, moving toward the door with the quick efficiency of a man escaping, but at the threshold he paused and looked back at Sarah. "Thank you," he said, "for last night, for this morning, for understanding." Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click that somehow felt final. Sarah stood in the kitchen, listening to the sound of his boots on the porch steps, the creak of the corral gate. She moved to the window and watched him join his men, watched the way they straightened in his presence, the way they looked to him for leadership despite his brokenness. Ethan Mallory was a good man trapped in the prison of his own grief. And Sarah, despite all her best intentions to keep this arrangement purely business, felt her heart beginning to lean toward him in ways that were dangerous, complicated, and entirely inappropriate. She was falling in love with a ghost, or rather, with a man who lived among ghosts, and she had no idea if there was room in his haunted heart for anything new, anything real, anything that wasn't colored by the weight of what he'd lost. The days began to take on a rhythm. Sarah would wake before dawn, start breakfast, and hear Ethan's quiet footsteps as he came in from the bunkhouse, because despite that one night, he'd returned to sleeping there, unable or unwilling to spend another night under his own roof. They'd share coffee in companionable silence while Grace slept upstairs, and Sarah would watch the sunrise paint colors across his tired face. He'd talk about the ranch, about the horses and cattle, about the men and their needs. She'd talk about the house, about repairs that needed doing, about Grace's progress. They never talked about anything personal, never crossed the careful boundaries they'd established. But the silence between them felt less empty each day, more like communication than avoidance. Grace flourished. With regular meals and warmth and safety, she transformed from the hollow-eyed child Sarah had carried into Morrison's store into something bright and alive. She followed Ethan around when he was near, chattering about everything and nothing. And Ethan, reserved, grief-locked Ethan, actually listened. He'd answer her questions about horses and clouds and why the wind blew, and Sarah would watch them together and feel her chest tighten with emotion she couldn't name. 2 weeks after their arrival, Sarah was in the parlor, dusting the piano, when she heard hoofbeats approaching, multiple horses, moving fast. She went to the window and felt her stomach drop. Judge Morrison sat astride a large bay horse, his face set in stern lines. Beside him rode Sheriff Thomas Garrett, Silas's superior, and several other men Sarah recognized from town. Behind them, in a small buggy, sat Margaret Pruitt and another woman Sarah didn't know, both looking grimly satisfied. They were here for an inspection. Sarah knew it in her bones. They were here to find fault, to condemn, to take Grace away. She ran upstairs, her heart pounding. "Grace, sweetheart, I need you to stay up here. Play quietly with Molly. Don't come down until Mama says, all right?" "Why, Mama?" Grace's face filled with confusion and the first hints of fear. "Just do as I say, baby. Please." Sarah hurried back downstairs just as the knock came, hard, authoritative, demanding. She smoothed her skirts, took a breath to steady herself, and opened the door. Judge Morrison's face was hard as granite. "Mrs. Whitfield, we're here on official business. I'll need to see the premises and speak with Mr. Mallory." "Mr. Mallory is working the north pasture," Sarah said, keeping her voice level despite the fear coursing through her. "He won't be back until evening." "Convenient," Margaret Pruitt said from behind the judge, her voice dripping with implication. "We'll wait," the judge said, "and while we wait, we'll conduct our inspection." Sarah had no choice but to step aside. The group filed in, their eyes already hunting for evidence of impropriety. The judge moved through the rooms with the practiced eye of a man looking for sin. The other woman, introduced as Mrs. Harriet Foster, the Reverend's wife, went straight for the stairs. "The bedrooms," she announced. "I need to see the sleeping arrangements." Sarah's blood ran cold. She followed the woman up the stairs, watching as Mrs. Foster pushed open doors, her mouth pursing with each discovery. She saw Grace's room, neat, clean, clearly a child's space. She saw the guest room, unused, the bed made with military precision. Then she reached the end of the hall and opened the master bedroom. Ethan's bedroom was exactly as it had been 3 years ago. Catherine's things still sat on the dressing table. The bed was made, clearly unslept in. It was a shrine, and Mrs. Foster saw it immediately. "He doesn't sleep here," she said, her voice carrying down the stairs. "No," Sarah admitted, seeing no point in lying. "He sleeps in the bunkhouse with the ranch hands, Mrs." Foster's eyes narrowed. "And where do you sleep, Mrs. Whitfield?" "In my room? Across from my daughter's?" Sarah lifted her chin, as is proper for a housekeeper and her child. "A housekeeper," Mrs. Foster repeated skeptically. She moved back downstairs, her skirts rustling with self-righteousness. "Judge Morrison, the sleeping arrangements appear to be, adequate, though highly irregular." The judge grunted. He was examining the parlor now, his eyes cataloging everything. "This is the house where the fire occurred? Where Mr. Mallory's family perished?" "Yes," Sarah said. "And he's brought you and your daughter to live here? In the very rooms where his wife and child died?" The judge's voice was heavy with implication. "Some might say that shows a remarkable lack of respect for the dead." Some might say it shows a man trying to live again instead of being buried with his grief, Sarah countered, her temper flaring despite the danger. Margaret Pruitt made a disapproving sound. Such familiar defense of your employer, Mrs. Whitfield. One might wonder at the nature of your relationship. One might wonder at a lot of things, Sarah shot back. Like why a group of supposedly Christian people are so determined to destroy a man who's committed no crime except showing mercy to a starving child. The judge's face darkened. Watch your tongue, woman. We're here because concerned citizens have raised questions about the propriety of this arrangement. A single man and a young widow living under the same roof. In separate buildings, Sarah interrupted. Mr. Mallory doesn't even sleep in this house. But he comes here, Mrs. Foster pressed. He takes meals here. He spends time with your daughter. People have seen him holding the child, carrying her. The intimacy of such behavior, the intimacy of a man being kind to a 4-year-old? Sarah's voice rose. The intimacy of basic human decency? Mrs. Whitfield, the judge began, but he was cut off by the sound of hoofbeats moving fast. Ethan burst through the door, his face flushed from hard riding, his eyes immediately finding Sarah's. Jack sent word there was trouble. What's going on here? Judge Morrison drew himself up. Mr. Mallory, we're conducting an inspection. There have been concerns raised about the living situation here, about the appropriateness of a single man employing a young widow, especially given the presence of a child. Ethan's jaw clenched. My household arrangements are my own business, Judge. Not when they involve potential moral corruption, Mrs. Foster interjected. Not when there's a child's welfare at stake. Grace's welfare? Ethan's voice was dangerously quiet. 2 weeks ago, you people watched that child starving and did nothing. Now you're concerned about her welfare? We're concerned about her moral education, the judge said, about the example being set, about what she's learning in a household where boundaries are blurred. What boundaries? Ethan demanded. Mrs. Whitfield is my employee. She has her own quarters. I have mine. We maintain complete propriety. Do you? Margaret Pruitt's voice was sly. Because my cousin's husband works on your ranch, Mr. Mallory, and he says you've been seen entering this house in the evenings, staying late, that you spent an entire night here just last week. Sarah's heart sank. The night Ethan had tried to sleep in the guest room. The night his men had found him in the kitchen. It had been witnessed, reported, twisted into something sordid. I worked late on accounts, Ethan said, his voice tight with controlled fury. I slept in the guest room rather than walk to the bunkhouse in the dark. That's all. That's all? Mrs. Foster's laugh was sharp. A man and a woman alone in a house at night with only a child as chaperone? Mr. Mallory, surely you can see how this appears. I see how it appears to minds looking for sin where there is none, Ethan shot back. Judge Morrison held up his hand. Regardless of the truth of the matter, the appearance is problematic. The town is talking. The church is concerned. And we have a duty to ensure that the child, Grace, is being raised in a proper environment. She's being raised with food and warmth and safety, Sarah said, her voice shaking with barely suppressed rage. Things you all denied her when she needed you most. She's being raised in a house of questionable morality, the judge countered, and as such, we're recommending that she be removed to more appropriate accommodations. The county home, no. Sarah's shout echoed through the house. You're not taking my daughter. We have the authority, the judge began, but Ethan cut him off. You have no authority here. This is my property. Grace is not being neglected or harmed. You have no legal grounds to remove her. We have moral grounds, Mrs. Foster said primly, and in matters of a child's welfare, moral grounds are sufficient. Sarah felt the world tilting beneath her feet. They were going to take Grace. These people who'd let her starve were going to take her away in the name of morality. The irony was so bitter she could taste it. Ethan must have seen the panic in Sarah's eyes because he moved closer to her, a protective gesture that didn't go unnoticed by their visitors. You're not taking that child, he said, his voice low and fierce. I won't allow it. You won't allow it? Judge Morrison's eyebrows rose. And what exactly is your relationship to the child, Mr. Mallory? What claim do you have? The claim of someone who saved her life when the rest of you turned your backs. That gives you no legal standing, the judge said. Unless, he paused, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. Unless there were to be a more permanent arrangement, a proper household structure. Sarah felt Ethan stiffen beside her. She understood what the judge was implying, the same thing Silas had suggested weeks ago in the general store. Marriage. The only way to make their living arrangement respectable in the eyes of the town. Are you suggesting, Ethan began, but the judge cut him off. I'm suggesting that if you care about this child's welfare as much as you claim, you'll consider what's best for her. A proper family structure, a legitimate household. Otherwise, we'll have no choice but to remove her to the county home until Mrs. Whitfield can find more appropriate employment and housing. Margaret Pruitt smiled, a cold, satisfied expression. It's really very simple, Mr. Mallory. Make an honest woman of Mrs. Whitfield, or lose the child. Those are your options. The silence that followed was suffocating. Sarah couldn't breathe, couldn't think. They were using Grace as leverage, forcing Ethan into a corner, demanding he sacrifice himself on the altar of their moral superiority. Get out. Ethan's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. Get out of my house, now. Mr. Mallory, the judge began. I said get out. Ethan's roar shook the windows. Before I throw you out myself, you come into my home, threaten an innocent child, demand I upend my entire life to satisfy your twisted sense of propriety? Get out. The visitors exchanged glances, clearly not expecting such forceful resistance. But they were outnumbered here. Ethan's ranch hands had gathered outside, drawn by the commotion, and they didn't look friendly. Judge Morrison drew himself up with as much dignity as he could muster. You have 1 week, Mr. Mallory, 1 week to make this situation respectable, or we'll be back with legal authority to remove the child. The choice is yours. They filed out, Margaret Pruitt casting one last triumphant look over her shoulder. The door closed behind them, and Sarah heard the sound of horses departing, carrying away the threat, but leaving the ultimatum behind. Ethan stood frozen, his hands clenched into fists, his breathing ragged. Sarah wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but her throat was closed with unshed tears. Finally, Ethan turned to her. I'm sorry, he said hoarsely. I'm so sorry. This is my fault. If I'd considered how it would look. You saved our lives, Sarah said through her tears. Don't apologize for that. But now they're threatening to take Grace because of me, because I was selfish enough to want to help without thinking about the consequences. You weren't selfish. You were kind. That's different. Ethan laughed bitterly. Kind. Kindness that might cost you your daughter. They stood in the ruins of their careful arrangement, surrounded by the ghosts of Ethan's past and the threats of their present. Upstairs, Sarah could hear Grace starting to cry, sensing the tension even from a distance. I need to go to her, Sarah whispered. She started for the stairs, but Ethan caught her arm. Sarah, wait. She turned back to him, saw the war raging in his storm-gray eyes, duty against desire, grief against hope, the past against the impossible future. There might be a way, he said slowly, as if each word cost him. A way to protect Grace, to keep you both safe from the town's judgment. Sarah's heart began to pound. She knew what he was going to say, knew it, and dreaded it, and desperately needed it all at once. What way? She whispered, even though she already knew the answer. Ethan's hand dropped from her arm. He took a step back, as if he needed distance to say what came next. The judge was right about one thing. If we were married, if this were a legitimate household, they'd have no grounds to take Grace, no moral authority to question our arrangement. Marriage, Sarah breathed the word like a prayer or a curse, she wasn't sure which. A marriage of convenience, Ethan clarified quickly. For Grace's protection, for your security, nothing more. We'd continue as we have been, separate lives, separate quarters, just a legal document to satisfy the town. Sarah looked at him, at this broken man offering her a broken solution to an impossible problem. Part of her wanted to refuse, to tell him they'd find another way. But the larger part, the part that had watched her daughter nearly die from starvation, knew there was no other way. All right, she said, I'll marry you. The words hung in the air between them like smoke after gunfire. Heavy, acrid, impossible to take back. Sarah watched Ethan's face shift through a dozen emotions in the span of a heartbeat. Relief, regret, something that might have been grief for the marriage he'd already had, the wife he'd already loved and lost. "You're sure?" His voice was barely above a whisper, as if speaking any louder might shatter whatever fragile resolve had brought them to this moment. Sarah thought of Grace upstairs, crying softly in Emma's old room, thought of the county home, that warehouse of forgotten children, thought of Judge Morrison's satisfied smirk and Margaret Pruitt's gleaming eyes. "I'm sure." Ethan nodded slowly, his jaw working as he swallowed whatever words he'd been about to say. "I'll ride into town tomorrow, make the arrangements with Reverend Foster. We can be married by the end of the week." "The same Reverend whose wife just threatened to take my daughter?" A ghost of a smile touched Ethan's lips, bitter and brief. "The very same. But he'll do it. His wife may have moral objections, but the Reverend himself knows which side his bread is buttered on. The Mallory family has been generous to his church over the years." "Buying a wedding with donations," Sarah said flatly. "Buying your daughter's safety," Ethan corrected. "There's a difference." Before Sarah could respond, they heard small footsteps on the stairs. Grace appeared, her face streaked with tears, Molly clutched tight against her chest. "Mama? Why were those people yelling? Are they going to take me away?" Sarah's heart cracked clean through. She dropped to her knees and pulled Grace into her arms, breathing in the scent of her daughter's hair, feeling the small, bird-quick beating of her heart. "No, baby. No one's taking you anywhere, I promise. But that lady said—" "That lady was wrong," Ethan said, moving closer. He knelt beside them both, his large frame somehow making them feel sheltered rather than crowded. "Grace, do you remember when I first brought you and your mama here, when I promised you'd be safe?" Grace nodded against Sarah's shoulder. "I meant it then, and I mean it now. You're safe here. With your mama. With me. No one's going to change that." He hesitated, then reached out and gently touched Grace's hair. "Your mama and I are going to make sure of it. We're going to get married, so we're a real family, so no one can ever question whether you belong here." Grace pulled back from Sarah's embrace, her tear-stained face swiveling between the two adults with a child's brutal honesty. "Married? Like you were married to Emma's mama?" The question landed like a physical blow. Sarah saw Ethan flinch, saw the color drain from his face. She started to intervene, to redirect, but Ethan held up a hand. "No, sweetheart," he said quietly. "Not like I was married to Catherine. That was different. That was love. This is—" He struggled for words that would make sense to a 4-year-old without being a lie. "This is protection. This is me and your mama making sure you're safe, making sure no one can hurt you ever again." Grace considered this with the solemn gravity only children could manage. "But you like Mama, don't you? And Mama likes you?" Yes," Ethan stammered. "Yes, I like your Mama very much. She's a good woman." "And I like Mr. Ethan," Sarah added, her voice thick with emotions she couldn't name. "He's a good man." "Then it's okay," Grace pronounced with the simple logic of the young. "Emma's Mama is in heaven with my papa. They can be married there, and you and Mama can be married here, so I can stay." The innocence of it, the pure, uncomplicated faith that love could exist in multiple forms, in multiple lifetimes, seemed to undo something in Ethan. He closed his eyes, his throat working, and when he opened them again, they glistened with unshed tears. "Yes," he said hoarsely, "so you can stay." Grace smiled then, the first real smile since the visitors had arrived, and threw her arms around both of them in an awkward, beautiful embrace that encompassed all their broken pieces. Sarah felt Ethan's arm come around her shoulders, hesitant at first, then firmer, and for just a moment they were what they were about to pretend to be, a family. Then the moment passed. Ethan pulled back first, clearing his throat, putting distance between himself and the intimacy that had briefly flared. "I should go. Tell the men what's happening. They'll need to know before the town gossip reaches them." "Ethan, Mr. Mallory," Sarah corrected herself, watching him stand and reach for his hat. "What do we tell people? About why we're marrying so suddenly?" He paused at the door, his back to her, his shoulders rigid. "We tell them the truth. That I realized I cared for you and Grace. that it made sense to formalize the arrangement, that I was ready to move forward. His voice dropped to something raw. We tell them everything except the part where it's a lie. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a finality that echoed through the suddenly too quiet house. Sarah sat back on her heels, Grace still in her arms, and wondered what she'd just agreed to. A marriage without love, a life without intimacy, a partnership built on necessity and grief and the desperate need to protect a child. It should have felt like defeat. Somehow, it felt like something else entirely, something she didn't dare name. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation that felt surreal, like watching someone else's life unfold. Ethan rode to town and returned with the news that Reverend Foster had agreed to perform the ceremony that Saturday. The Reverend's wife had, according to Ethan, looked as if she'd swallowed something sour, but she'd kept her objections to herself. "The judge will be there," Ethan had said, his jaw tight. "And Mrs. Pruitt, and half the town, I'd wager. They want to see if we'll actually go through with it." "Then we'll give them a show," Sarah had replied with more confidence than she felt. Now standing in Catherine's old bedroom, her bedroom, she supposed, though the thought felt like trespassing, Sarah stared at the dress laid out on the bed. It wasn't Catherine's wedding dress. Ethan had been clear about that. "That's packed away," he'd said gruffly. "Put away proper. It's just a dress Catherine wore to church. Something nice, if you want it." It was beautiful. Deep blue silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, the kind of dress Sarah hadn't worn since before Thomas died, since before poverty had stripped away everything except survival. She touched the fabric tentatively, half expecting Catherine's ghost to materialize and demand she step away from what wasn't hers. "Mama, you look sad." Grace stood in the doorway, already dressed in a new frock Ethan had purchased in town, pale yellow with ribbon trim that made her look like a daffodil. "Not sad, sweetheart, just thinking." "About marrying Mr. Ethan?" "Yes." Grace crossed to the bed and ran her small fingers over the blue silk. "Emma's mama was pretty. I saw her picture. Do you think she'd mind you wearing her dress?" Sarah's throat tightened. "I don't know, baby. I hope not." "I think she'd be happy," Grace said with the certainty of a child who'd already worked through the complicated ethics of the situation. "I think she'd want Mr. Ethan to not be so sad anymore. And you make him not sad. Sometimes. I've seen it." "Do I?" Sarah asked, surprised. "When you make him laugh at breakfast. When you fixed his shirt button and he smiled. When he watches you play piano, he stands in the doorway sometimes, did you know? And his face gets soft." Grace climbed onto the bed, careful not to wrinkle the dress. "I think Emma's mama would want that. Someone to make his face get soft again." Sarah pulled Grace into her arms, overwhelmed by her daughter's wisdom, her capacity for understanding things that most adults couldn't grasp. "When did you get so smart?" "I've always been smart, Mama. You just worry too much to notice sometimes." A knock at the door made them both turn. Ethan stood there, already dressed in his Sunday best, a black suit that made his shoulders look impossibly broad, his gray eyes impossibly deep. His hair was freshly cut, his jaw freshly shaved, and for a moment Sarah forgot to breathe. "The wagon's ready," he said, his voice careful, formal. "We should leave soon if we're going to make it to town on time." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. Ethan's eyes drifted to the blue dress on the bed, and something flickered across his face, pain, memory, something complicated and deep. "Catherine wore that the last Easter we had together," he said quietly. "She loved that dress, said the color reminded her of prairie sky." He paused, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "She'd want it worn again. Want it to mean something instead of just gathering dust." "Are you sure?" Sarah asked. "I can wear something else. I don't want to—" "Wear it," Ethan said firmly. "Please. It deserves to be part of something good, even if that something is just keeping Grace safe." He left before Sarah could respond, his footsteps heavy on the stairs. Grace looked up at her mother with solemn eyes. "See? He wants you to wear it. Emma's mama wants you to wear it. Everyone wants you to wear it, except you." "You're too smart for your own good," Sarah said, but she was smiling as she said it. 20 minutes later, Sarah descended the stairs in Catherine's blue dress, her hair pinned up in the only style she remembered from her own wedding day, her hands trembling slightly. Ethan waited at the bottom, and when he saw her, he went absolutely still. Sarah, he breathed, and the way he said her name, with wonder and grief and something that might have been longing, made her chest tighten. It fits well enough, she said, suddenly self-conscious. I hope it's appropriate for... You're beautiful. The words came out rough, as if torn from somewhere deep. Catherine was beautiful in that dress, and you're beautiful in it, and I... He stopped, shook his head as if to clear it. We should go. The ride to town was quiet. Grace chattered occasionally, pointing out birds and clouds, but Sarah and Ethan were locked in their own thoughts. Sarah kept sneaking glances at him, at the hard line of his jaw, the way his hands gripped the reins with white-knuckled intensity. This man was about to become her husband. This stranger who'd saved her daughter's life. This ghost who lived among ghosts. What had she agreed to? Silverton came into view too soon. As Ethan had predicted, a crowd had gathered outside the small church. Judge Morrison with his perpetual scowl, Margaret Pruitt practically vibrating with vindicated superiority, Sheriff Garrett looking uncomfortable, and what seemed like half the town's population, all hungry for drama. Vultures, Ethan muttered under his breath. Then louder to Sarah. Are you ready? No, Sarah admitted, but that's never stopped me before. Something like respect flickered in Ethan's eyes. He climbed down from the wagon and came around to her side, offering his hand. When she took it, his grip was warm, solid, real. He lifted her down, then reached for Grace, settling the little girl on his hip as naturally as if he'd been doing it all her life. They walked toward the church together, this makeshift family, and Sarah felt the weight of every judgmental eye upon them. She lifted her chin, squared her shoulders, and met their stares with as much dignity as she could muster. Margaret Pruitt stepped forward, her smile sharp as a knife. Mrs. Whitfield, Mr. Mallory, how convenient that you've decided to marry so quickly. One might almost think you had something to hide. One might think a lot of things, Ethan said coldly. Most of them would be wrong. Judge Morrison's eyes narrowed as he studied them. This is quite the turn of events, Mallory. Just weeks ago, you were a hermit who wouldn't even sleep in his own house. Now you're taking a wife? People change, Judge. Life changes. I'm allowed to move forward. Are you? The judge's voice was sharp. Or are you simply doing what's necessary to avoid legal complications? Does it matter? Sarah spoke up, her voice clear and strong despite the trembling in her limbs. We're here. We're getting married. Grace will have a proper home, a proper family. Isn't that what you wanted? What I want, the judge said slowly, is to ensure that this child isn't being used as a pawn in some elaborate scheme. The only scheme here, Ethan said, his voice dangerous, is the one you and your ilk concocted to force my hand. But I'm not doing this because you demanded it. I'm doing it because I want to, because Sarah and Grace deserve protection, deserve security, deserve a life without people like you constantly threatening to tear it apart. The crowd murmured. Sarah saw some faces showing approval, others skepticism. Silas Blackwood stood off to the side, his expression unreadable, but his hand rested on his gun belt in a way that made Sarah's skin crawl. Reverend Foster appeared in the church doorway, his round face sheened with nervous sweat. Perhaps we should proceed inside. The ceremony is ready to begin. They filed into the church, the crowd pressing in behind them like a wave. The interior was cool and dim, sunlight filtering through simple stained glass windows. Sarah had been married to Thomas in this very church 9 years ago, in front of friends and family who'd celebrated their union with joy and hope. Now she walked down the same aisle toward a marriage that was all strategy and no love, all necessity and no choice, and tried not to feel like she was betraying every vow she'd ever made. Ethan must have sensed her hesitation because his hand found hers, squeezed gently. We don't have to do this, he whispered. If you want to walk away, we'll find another way. I won't force you into this. Sarah looked up at him, at this man who'd shown her more kindness in 3 weeks than the rest of the town had in 2 years. I'm not being forced. I'm choosing this. I'm choosing Grace's safety. I'm choosing... She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Choosing you, her heart whispered. But she couldn't say that, couldn't admit that somewhere in the past 3 weeks, Amid the grief and the ghosts and the impossible circumstances, she'd started to feel something for Ethan Mallory that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the way her heart stumbled when he smiled, the way her breath caught when he was near. They reached the altar. Reverend Foster opened his Bible with hands that trembled slightly. Behind them, the church was packed, every pew filled with witnesses who'd come to watch them either triumph or fail. "Dearly beloved," the Reverend began, his voice carrying through the hushed space, "we are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The familiar words washed over Sarah like a tide. She heard them as if from a great distance, her mind unable to fully process what was happening. This was real. This was actually happening. In a few minutes, she would be Mrs. Ethan Mallory, wife to a man she barely knew, stepmother to a ghost. "Marriage is not to be entered into lightly," Reverend Foster continued, and Sarah almost laughed at the irony. Nothing about this was light. This was the heaviest decision she'd ever made, weighted with consequences she couldn't begin to imagine. "If anyone here has objections to this union, speak now or forever hold your peace." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah held her breath, half expecting Judge Morrison to stand up, to voice some legal objection, to stop this before it could be completed. But he remained seated, his face carved from stone, saying nothing. "Very well." The Reverend turned to Ethan. "Ethan James Mallory, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Ethan's jaw worked. Sarah saw him swallow hard, saw the war raging in his storm-gray eyes. He was thinking of Catherine, she knew. Thinking of the vows he'd already made, already broken through no fault of his own. Thinking of the promises he'd never thought he'd make again. "I do." His voice was steady, firm, final. The Reverend turned to Sarah. "Sarah Elizabeth Whitfield, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Sarah thought of Thomas, thought of the love they'd shared, the life they'd built, the promises they'd made in this very church. She thought of Grace, waiting with Jack Reeves at the back of the church, her whole future hanging on Sarah's answer. She thought of Ethan, this broken, beautiful man offering her everything and nothing all at once. "I do." "The rings, please." Sarah's heart stuttered. They hadn't discussed rings. In all the rush and chaos, it hadn't even occurred to her. But Ethan was reaching into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box that looked worn with age. He opened it, and Sarah's breath caught. 2 rings lay nested in faded silk, a simple gold band and a ring with a small, perfect sapphire that caught the light and threw it back in shades of blue that matched her dress, matched the prairie sky, matched Catherine's favorite color. "These were my mother's," Ethan said quietly, his voice meant only for her ears. "She gave them to Catherine when we married. Catherine wore them until the end. I want you to have them now. Not as a replacement, not as forgetting, but as a continuation, as a promise that good things can still happen even after the world has ended." Sarah's eyes burned with tears. "Ethan, I can't. These are too precious. They're yours now. If you'll take them. Please, Sarah, let me do this one thing right." How could she refuse? How could she deny him this gesture that clearly cost him everything? Sarah nodded, unable to speak, and watched through blurred vision as Ethan took the smaller ring from the box. Reverend Foster cleared his throat. "Repeat after me. With this ring, I thee wed." Ethan's hands were steady as he slipped the ring onto Sarah's finger. "With this ring, I thee wed." His voice was low, intimate, meant for her alone despite the crowd watching. "I promise to protect you, to provide for you in grace, to honor you as my wife in every way that matters." The Reverend prompted Sarah. She took the gold band with trembling fingers and reached for Ethan's left hand. His wedding ring from Catherine was still there, she noticed. He wore it still, even now. The gold band from his mother's set would go on his right hand instead. "With this ring, I thee wed," Sarah whispered. As she slid the ring onto his finger, she added her own promise. One not in any ceremony but pulled from her heart. I promise to respect your grief, to honor your past, to build a future that doesn't erase what came before. Something shifted in Ethan's expression. Surprise? Gratitude? Something deeper that he quickly shuddered away. Reverend Foster's voice rang out over them. By the power vested in me by the territory of Kansas, I now pronounce you man and wife. He paused, looking distinctly uncomfortable. You may kiss the bride. Sarah's heart stopped. They hadn't discussed this either. Hadn't talked about what would happen at this moment, what performance they'd need to give for the watching crowd. She looked up at Ethan and saw her own panic reflected in his eyes. But the crowd was watching, waiting, judging. They needed to sell this, needed to make it believable, needed to convince everyone that this was a real marriage born of real feeling. Ethan's hand came up to cup Sarah's cheek, his touch gentle despite the calluses. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away, time to refuse. But Sarah didn't pull away. She lifted her face to his, closed her eyes, and felt his lips brush against hers in a kiss that was meant to be chaste, perfunctory, just for show. Except it wasn't. The moment their lips met, something electric passed between them. Sarah felt it in her bones, in her blood, in the way her breath caught and her heart stuttered. Ethan's hand tightened on her cheek, his other arm coming around her waist to pull her closer, and the kiss deepened into something real, something raw, something that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with 3 weeks of longing neither of them had acknowledged. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Sarah saw her own shock mirrored in Ethan's eyes. That wasn't supposed to happen. That kiss was supposed to be a lie, a show, a necessary fiction. It wasn't supposed to feel like truth. The church erupted in polite applause. Grace came running down the aisle, throwing herself at both of them with a delighted squeal. You're married! You're really married! We're a family now! Sarah lifted Grace into her arms, using her daughter as a shield against the intensity of Ethan's gaze. Yes, baby, we're a family now. But even as she said it, even as she felt Ethan's arm come around both of them in a protective gesture that made the crowd murmur with approval, Sarah wondered what kind of family they'd really become. A real one? Or just a convincing performance of one? The crowd began to file out, offering congratulations that ranged from genuine to grudging. Judge Morrison approached, his face still stern, but something like acceptance in his eyes. Well, Mallory, you've made an honest woman of her. The child can stay. The child was always staying, Ethan said coldly. This changes nothing except making it legal. It changes everything, the judge countered. In the eyes of the law, in the eyes of God, in the eyes of this community. You're responsible for her now. For both of them. I trust you understand the weight of that responsibility. I've understood it from the moment I saw Grace dying in Sarah's arms, Ethan replied. This ceremony didn't create my obligation. It just formalized what was already there. The judge studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Perhaps you're a better man than I gave you credit for, Mallory. He turned to Sarah. Mrs. Mallory, I hope you'll be happy, truly. Sarah nearly laughed at the absurdity of it. This man who'd threatened to take her daughter, who'd forced them into this marriage, now wished her happiness. But she bit back the bitter words and simply nodded. Thank you, Judge. Margaret Pruitt was less gracious. She swept past with her nose in the air, muttering something about unseemly haste and the wages of sin. But even her disapproval couldn't dampen the relief Sarah felt. They'd done it. They'd actually done it. Grace was safe. Jack Reeves approached, his weathered face creased in a genuine smile. Boss Mrs. Mallory, congratulations. The boys and I were real happy for you. Been hoping you'd find your way back to living again, sir. Thank you, Jack, Ethan said, his voice gruff with emotion. That means more than you know. We've got a little celebration set up back at the ranch, Jack continued. Nothing fancy, but we wanted to mark the occasion proper. Hope that's all right. Ethan looked at Sarah, a question in his eyes. She nodded. That would be lovely, Jack. Thank you. As they made their way out of the church and back to the wagon, Sarah felt the weight of the ring on her finger, Catherine's ring, now hers. It felt like a promise and a burden all at once. She glanced at Ethan walking beside her, Grace perched on his shoulders now, laughing at something he'd said. This was her husband. This stranger who'd saved her life. This ghost who walked among ghosts. This man whose kiss had set her entire world tilting on its axis. What had she done? The ranch hands had outdone themselves. When the wagon pulled up to the main house, Sarah saw tables set up in the yard, laden with food the ranch cook had prepared. Someone had strung up lanterns that would glow once the sun set. The men stood in a loose circle, cleaned up and dressed in their Sunday best, grinning with the particular joy of people celebrating their boss finally rejoining the living. "Welcome home, Mrs. Mallory," one of them called out, and the others took up the cheer. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the genuine warmth in their voices. These men didn't know the truth of the arrangement. To them, this was a real marriage, a real new beginning for their boss. And maybe, Sarah thought, maybe that's what it needed to be. Maybe if they pretended long enough, it would become real. Ethan helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering on her waist a moment longer than necessary. Their eyes met, and Sarah saw the same confusion she felt reflected in his gaze. That kiss had changed something between them, cracked open a door they'd both been trying to keep firmly closed. "Thank you," he said softly, "for doing this. For Grace, for everything." "You keep thanking me," Sarah replied, "but you're the one who saved us. You're the one who gave up your peace, your solitude, your carefully ordered grief. I should be thanking you." "Maybe we're both just doing what we have to do," Ethan said, "and maybe that's enough." But it wasn't enough. Sarah knew it the moment he said it. Doing what they had to do, maintaining a marriage of convenience, living separate lives under the same roof, it had seemed possible before that kiss. Now, with her lips still tingling from the feel of his, with her heart still racing from the way he'd held her, it seemed impossible. The celebration lasted into the evening. The ranch hands brought out fiddles and guitars, and music filled the air. Grace danced with anyone who'd take her hand, her laughter bright and pure. Sarah found herself pulled into conversations with the men's wives, women from neighboring ranches who'd come to welcome her, who treated her like a real bride rather than a woman who'd been bought and paid for with charity. Ethan stood slightly apart, watching it all with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read. Jack Reeves joined him, and Sarah saw them talking in low voices, saw Jack clap Ethan on the shoulder with obvious affection. "He's a good man," a voice said beside her. Sarah turned to find an older woman with kind eyes and silver hair. "Mrs. Patterson, from the Double Creek Ranch. My husband, Henry, works with Ethan on cattle drives." "It's nice to meet you," Sarah said automatically. "He's been dead for 3 years, you know," Mrs. Patterson continued, not unkindly. "Not physically, but in every way that matters. When Catherine and Emma died, the light just went out of him. We all thought it was gone forever." She paused, studying Sarah with sharp eyes. "But I've been watching him tonight, watching the way he looks at you when he thinks no one's paying attention. And I'm thinking maybe the light isn't quite as gone as we all believed." Sarah's throat tightened. "Mrs. Patterson, I don't think—" "You don't have to explain, dear. Whatever brought you two together, however it happened, I can see it's real. Maybe it started as something else, but it's becoming real. That's what matters." Was it real? Sarah wanted to ask. Or was it just two desperate people clinging to each other in a storm? But before she could form the words, Ethan was there, his hand gentle on her elbow. "May I steal my wife for a dance?" he asked Mrs. Patterson, and the formal way he said "my wife" sent shivers down Sarah's spine. Mrs. Patterson smiled knowingly. "Of course. Go on, you two." Ethan led Sarah to the makeshift dance floor, where other couples swayed to a slow waltz. His hand settled on her waist, hers on his shoulder, and they began to move in time with the music. "I'm not a very good dancer," Sarah admitted. "Thomas and we never really—" "You're fine," Ethan said, his voice low and close to her ear. "Just follow my lead." They moved together in silence for a moment, finding their rhythm. Sarah was acutely aware of every point of contact, his hand warm on her waist, her fingers resting on his broad shoulder, the scant inches of space between them that felt both too much and not enough. "That kiss," Ethan said suddenly. "Earlier, in the church, It was for show," Sarah interrupted quickly. "I know, for the crowd, to make it believable." "Was it?" Ethan's eyes searched hers. Because it didn't feel like show to me, Sarah. It felt real. Too real. Sarah's breath caught. Ethan, we can't. We agreed this was just for Grace. Just for. I know what we agreed, he said roughly. But that was before I kissed you. Before I felt. He trailed off, shaking his head. Never mind. Forget I said anything. This is complicated enough without me making it worse. But Sarah didn't want to forget. Didn't want to pretend that kiss hadn't happened, hadn't meant something. What did you feel? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's hand tightened on her waist, pulling her imperceptibly closer. Like I was betraying Catherine. Like I was dishonoring her memory by wanting something, someone else. But also like, he swallowed hard, like I was finally breathing again after 3 years of drowning. The confession hung between them, raw and honest and terrifying. Sarah felt her eyes burn with tears she refused to shed. I felt like I was betraying Thomas, like I had no right to feel anything for another man when my husband has been dead less time than yours. But I did feel something, Ethan. I felt, don't, Ethan said, his voice pained. Don't say it. Not yet. Not until we're sure. Not until we know what this is. The music swelled around them, and they continued to dance, two broken people trying to figure out if their pieces might somehow fit together. The night grew darker, the lanterns glowing brighter, and Sarah felt something shifting between them with each step, each breath, each moment their eyes met and held. This marriage was supposed to be a fiction, a necessary performance. But somewhere between the vows and the kiss and this dance under the Kansas stars, it had started to become something else. Something neither of them had planned for, neither of them was ready for, neither of them knew how to navigate. Grace ran up to them, breathless from playing tag with the ranch hand's children. Mama, Mr. Ethan, come see. The stars are so bright tonight. They broke apart, the spell broken, and followed Grace to where a group had gathered to stargaze. Someone pointed out constellations, telling stories about the shapes they made. Grace pressed against Ethan's side, her small hand finding his, and Sarah saw his face soften as he looked down at her. Look, Mama, Grace pointed up. That one looks like a horse, and that one looks like Emma's doll. Sarah felt Ethan stiffen beside her at the mention of Emma's name. But when she glanced at him, she didn't see pain. She saw something gentler, something almost like peace. Emma would have loved this, he said quietly. She was always making up stories about the stars. Catherine would tell her the real constellation names, but Emma preferred her own versions. It was the first time Sarah had heard him speak of his daughter without his voice breaking, without the weight of grief making the words almost impossible. He was remembering with love instead of just loss. Tell me, Sarah said impulsively. Tell me about her, about them both. Ethan looked at her in surprise. You want to hear about my dead wife and child? On our wedding day? I want to know the people who made you who you are, Sarah said firmly. I want to understand what I'm stepping into, what I'm becoming part of, and I want Grace to know too. She lives in Emma's room, plays with Emma's toys. She should know about the little girl who had them first. Something shifted in Ethan's expression. Gratitude, wonder, something that looked almost like love. All right, he said. All right, I'll tell you. He settled on the ground, Grace climbing into his lap, and Sarah sat beside them. The other ranch hands and their families drifted away, giving them privacy, and Ethan began to speak. Catherine was a school teacher when I met her, came out from Boston to teach in the territory school. Everyone said she wouldn't last a month, too refined, too delicate for prairie life. But she proved them all wrong. She was strong in ways that had nothing to do with muscle, strong in spirit, in determination, in love. His voice was soft, reverent, painting pictures with words. Emma was born 5 years into our marriage. Catherine said she was a miracle because we'd started to think we couldn't have children, and she was perfect. Dark curls like her mother, gray eyes like me, and a smile that could light up the darkest day. Grace listened with rapt attention. What games did she like to play? Hide and seek. She'd hide in the same place every time, behind the parlor curtains, and every time she'd giggle so loud I could find her in seconds. But I'd always pretend I couldn't find her, make a big show of looking everywhere else first, just to hear that laugh. Did she like dolls? Grace asked, holding Molly tighter. Loved them. Molly was her favorite. She'd tell Molly everything, all her secrets, all her dreams. Catherine used to say Emma would grow up to be a storyteller, the way she'd create these elaborate adventures for her dolls. Sarah listened to him talk, watched the way the memories softened his features, made him look younger, less burdened. This was healing, she realized. Not the forgetting kind of healing, but the remembering kind. The kind that honored the dead by keeping them alive in memory, in story, in love that transcended loss. The day of the fire, Ethan continued, his voice growing rougher. I was supposed to be home, but one of the northern fence lines had broken, cattle were getting out. I rode up to fix it, thinking I'd be back by dinner. I didn't know... He stopped, swallowed hard. I didn't know it was the last time I'd see them alive. Didn't know that when I kissed Catherine goodbye that morning, it was really goodbye. That when Emma asked me to stay and play, and I said later there wouldn't be a later. Sarah's hand found his, squeezed gently. Ethan looked at their joined hands, his right hand with his mother's ring now, her left hand with Catherine's, and something in his expression cracked open. I've been so angry, he whispered, at God, at fate, at myself. So angry that I couldn't even grieve properly, couldn't honor them properly, could only preserve everything exactly as it was and punish myself by refusing to live in it. But that's not what they'd want. Catherine would hate knowing I've been sleeping in the bunkhouse for 3 years. Emma would be furious that no one's played with her toys. Then maybe it's time to stop punishing yourself, Sarah said gently. Maybe it's time to live again, even if living means feeling the grief alongside the joy. Ethan looked at her then, really looked at her, and Sarah saw the walls crumbling, saw the man beneath the grief beginning to emerge. I don't know how, he admitted. I've forgotten how to live, how to be anything except this broken thing. Then we'll figure it out together, Sarah said. One day at a time, one moment at a time. You don't have to do it alone anymore, Ethan. That's what marriage means, isn't it? Even one like ours. We carry each other's burdens, we share the weight. Grace yawned hugely, interrupting the moment. I'm sleepy, Mama. Ethan stood, lifting Grace effortlessly. Let's get you to bed, little one. They walked back to the house together, the party winding down behind them. Inside, the familiar room seemed different somehow, less like a tomb, more like a home. Ethan carried Grace upstairs while Sarah followed, and together they tucked her into Emma's bed. Good night, Mama. Good night, Papa. The word, Papa, stopped them both cold. Grace had never called Ethan that before, had always maintained the formal Mr. Ethan despite their growing closeness. But now, exhausted and content and feeling safe, she'd given him the title that meant family, that meant forever. Ethan's eyes glistened as he bent to kiss Grace's forehead. Good night, sweetheart. Sweet dreams. In the hallway, after Grace's door was closed, they stood in awkward silence. The master bedroom loomed at the end of the hall, Ethan's room, Catherine's room, the room that was now theoretically theirs to share. I'll take the guest room, Ethan said quickly. Or the bunkhouse. Whatever you're comfortable with. Sarah looked at the closed door at the end of the hall, thought about everything Ethan had said about needing to live again, about honoring the dead by not dying himself. No, she said firmly. You'll sleep in your own bed, in your own room. It's time, Ethan. Sarah, I can't. You can. You will. But not tonight. Tonight you'll sleep in the guest room, and tomorrow we'll start fresh. Tomorrow we'll begin the work of turning this house back into a home, together. Ethan's throat worked as he swallowed. And you? Where will you sleep? In my room, across from Grace, where I've been sleeping all along. Sarah paused. This doesn't have to change everything overnight. We'll take it slow. Figure out what this marriage is, what it can be, but we'll do it honestly, without hiding, without running away from the hard things. I don't deserve you, Ethan said hoarsely. I don't deserve this second chance. None of us deserve what we get, Sarah replied. Good or bad. We just have to decide what we do with it, and I'm deciding to build something good here. With you. For Grace. For all of us. She reached up and touched his cheek, feeling the rough stubble there, the warmth of his skin. Thank you for marrying me, Ethan Mallory, for saving my daughter, for letting us into your haunted house and your broken heart. Then, before she could lose her courage, Before she could second-guess the impulse, Sarah stood on her toes and pressed a kiss to his cheek, soft, chaste, nothing like the kiss in the church, but somehow even more intimate for its tenderness. "Good night, husband," she whispered. "Good night, wife," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. Sarah walked to her room, closed the door behind her, and leaned against it, her heart racing. Through the wall, she could hear Ethan moving in the guest room, settling in for the night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, new complications. But tonight, they'd made it through. They'd married to save Grace, but in doing so, they'd opened a door to something neither of them had expected. Sarah touched the ring on her finger, Catherine's ring, and sent up a silent prayer to the woman who'd worn it first. "Thank you for loving him. Thank you for teaching him how to love. And please, if you can hear me, help me love him the way he deserves. Help me honor what you built while building something new." The house settled around her with the familiar creaks and sighs of old wood. But for the first time since arriving, Sarah didn't feel like she was trespassing. She felt like she was home. Sarah woke to the sound of voices drifting up from downstairs. Not angry voices this time, but something else. Laughter. She lay still for a moment, disoriented by the unfamiliar sound, then realized with a start that one of those laughing voices belonged to Ethan. She rose quickly, smoothing her nightgown and reaching for her wrapper. The morning sun streamed through the window, painting everything in shades of gold. Through the glass, she could see the prairie stretching endlessly, beautiful and wild, and somehow less lonely than it had seemed just yesterday. Downstairs, she found Ethan and Grace in the kitchen. Ethan stood at the stove, an apron tied somewhat awkwardly around his waist, attempting to flip pancakes while Grace sat on the counter beside him, flour dusting her nose and cheeks. "You have to flip it fast, Papa," Grace was saying, her tone serious and instructive. "Mama showed me. Fast like this." She demonstrated with her small hands, nearly toppling off the counter before Ethan steadied her with one hand. "Papa," Sarah heard herself say, the word escaping before she could stop it. Ethan turned, his face flushing slightly. "She started it," he said, almost defensive. "This morning, when she came down. I didn't ask her to. I didn't expect—" "It's all right," Sarah said softly, moving into the room. The domesticity of the scene struck her with unexpected force. This man who'd been a stranger a month ago, now wearing an apron and making breakfast with her daughter, both of them covered in flour and looking more at peace than she'd seen either of them. "We wanted to surprise you," Grace announced proudly. "Papa said you needed to sleep because yesterday was a very big day and you must be tired from getting married." "Did he now?" Sarah caught Ethan's eye, saw the mixture of embarrassment and something tender there. "I also said we'd probably burn the house down trying to make breakfast, but Grace was insistent." Ethan gestured to the slightly lopsided stack of pancakes on a nearby plate. "They're not pretty, but they're edible. Mostly." Sarah moved to inspect their handiwork, fighting back a smile. The pancakes were indeed a disaster. Some burned, some undercooked, all of them misshapen. But they'd been made with care, made with love. Made by a man trying desperately to figure out how to be a father again. "They're perfect," she said, and meant it. They ate breakfast together at the kitchen table, Grace chattering about the wedding, about the dancing, about how pretty Mama had looked in the blue dress. Ethan was quieter, but Sarah caught him watching them with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Wonder mixed with fear, hope tangled with grief. "I thought we might work on the garden today," Sarah ventured as she cleared the plates. "It's completely overgrown. Grace and I could weed, maybe plant some vegetables for the fall." Ethan's hand stilled on his coffee cup. "Catherine's garden," he said quietly. "She loved that garden. Spent hours out there. Said it was her thinking place." "We don't have to," Sarah said quickly. "If it's too much, no." Ethan set down his cup with deliberate care. "No, you're right. It should be used, should be something other than a memorial." He paused, then added, "I'll help if you want. I'm not much good with plants, but I can dig and haul." They spent the morning in the garden, the three of them working side by side under the Kansas sun. Grace appointed herself supervisor, pointing out weeds with the authority of a general commanding troops. Ethan worked with quiet efficiency, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his hands sure and strong as he turned the soil. Sarah found herself stealing glances at him when she thought he wasn't looking. The way the sunlight caught in his hair, the play of muscles beneath his shirt. the rare smile that crossed his face when Grace said something particularly charming. This was her husband, she reminded herself. This man was legally bound to her now, for better or worse. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it sent a warm flutter through her chest. Sarah. Ethan's voice pulled her from her thoughts. He was standing over a small patch of earth near the fence, his expression arrested. Come look at this. She moved to his side, Grace trailing behind, and looked down at what he'd uncovered. Small green shoots were pushing up through the soil, bulbs that had been planted long ago and forgotten, now returning despite years of neglect. Tulips, Ethan breathed. Catherine planted tulip bulbs the fall before. He stopped, cleared his throat. She never got to see them bloom. That first spring after, they came up, and I couldn't bear to look at them. Had Jack plow them under. But I guess some survived, waiting all this time. Sarah knelt beside the tender shoots, touched one gently. They're beautiful, stubborn, refusing to give up even when everything seemed hopeless. Like someone else I know, Ethan said, and when Sarah looked up, she found him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. The moment stretched between them, weighted with all the things they hadn't said, all the feelings they were afraid to name. Then Grace crashed through it with the perfect timing of a child. Can we plant more? I want to plant flowers everywhere. Red ones and yellow ones and purple ones. Ethan laughed, the sound rusty but real. We can plant whatever you want, sweetheart. This is your garden now, too. Our garden, Grace corrected, her small hand reaching for Ethan's, then Schulte's, connecting them all. Our family garden. They worked until the sun was high overhead, their hands dirty, their backs aching, but something in the air between them had shifted. The tension that had defined their first weeks together had eased into something more comfortable, more real. They were learning each other's rhythms, finding ways to exist in the same space without the constant awareness of boundaries and barriers. That afternoon, while Grace napped upstairs, Sarah found Ethan in the study, staring at the ledgers spread across the desk, but clearly not seeing them. She knocked softly on the doorframe, and he looked up with a start. I didn't mean to disturb you, she said. You're not. I was just... He gestured vaguely at the papers, pretending to work. Mostly failing. Sarah moved into the room, drawn by something in his expression, a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. What's wrong? Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing patterns on the desk. Last night, he said finally, when Grace called me Papa, it was... He stopped, struggled for words. It felt like a betrayal, like I was replacing Emma, like I was using Grace to fill a hole that should stay empty. Sarah's heart ached for him. She crossed to the desk, perched on the edge beside him. You're not replacing Emma, Ethan. You could never replace her. But Grace needs a father, and you need to remember how to be one. There's no betrayal in that. Isn't there? His eyes met hers, haunted. I failed Emma. Failed to protect her. And now I'm taking on another little girl, making promises I might not be able to keep. What if something happens? What if I fail again? Then we'll face it together, Sarah said firmly. That's what you told me, remember? That we'd carry each other's burdens. Well, this is a burden, Ethan, this fear, and I'm here to help you carry it. Ethan's hand found hers on the desk, his fingers tangling with hers in a gesture that was becoming familiar, comforting. How did you get to be so wise? Starvation and desperation, Sarah said wryly. They're excellent teachers. The laugh that escaped him was surprised, genuine. You're extraordinary, Sarah Mallory. You know that? Sarah Mallory. The name still felt strange on her ears, like a coat that didn't quite fit. But hearing it from Ethan's lips, spoken with something that sounded almost like reverence, made it feel right. I'm just doing what I have to do, she said. Same as you. No. Ethan's grip on her hand tightened. You're doing more than that. You're healing this house. Healing me. Giving me a reason to stop hiding, to stop running from everything this place represents. I'm not trying to heal you, Ethan. I'm just trying to live. To build a life for Grace, for myself, and maybe... She hesitated, then pushed forward. Maybe for you too, if you'll let me. The air between them crackled with tension, with possibility. Ethan's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand, the touch innocent but somehow intimate. Sarah found herself leaning closer, drawn by something she couldn't name, didn't want to examine too closely. "Sarah," Ethan breathed, her name a question and a prayer all at once. The sound of hoofbeats outside shattered the moment. They sprang apart like guilty teenagers, Ethan moving to the window while Sarah tried to calm her racing heart. Through the glass, she saw riders approaching, at least a dozen of them moving with purpose. "It's the judge," Ethan said, his voice tight, "and Sheriff Garrett, and half the damn town council." He turned to Sarah, his expression grim. "They're not done with us yet." Sarah's stomach dropped. They'd been married less than a day. What more could the town possibly want? But she squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and moved to stand beside Ethan. "Then we'll face them together, as a family." They met the delegation on the porch. Judge Morrison sat astride his horse, his face set in stern lines that promised trouble. Sheriff Garrett looked distinctly uncomfortable, his eyes darting between Ethan and the judge as if caught between duty and friendship. "Mr. Mallory." "Mrs. Mallory." The judge's acknowledgement of Sarah's new name was grudging at best. "We need to speak with you both. It's a matter of some urgency." "We're listening," Ethan said, his voice carefully neutral. The judge dismounted, gesturing for the others to do the same. He pulled a sheaf of papers from his saddlebag, his movements deliberate and formal. "It has come to our attention that there may be irregularities regarding your marriage. Questions have been raised about the legitimacy of the union." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. "What questions? We were legally married by Reverend Foster. You were there. You witnessed it yourself." "The ceremony was legal, yes," the judge conceded. "But there are those who believe the marriage was undertaken under false pretenses, that it's a sham designed to circumvent the proper placement of the child." "A sham?" Ethan's voice was dangerously quiet. "We're legally married. We spoke vows before God and community. What more do you want?" Margaret Pruitt emerged from the group, her face pinched with righteous satisfaction. "We want proof that this is a real marriage, Mr. Mallory, not just a legal arrangement to avoid proper scrutiny." "Proof?" Sarah heard herself say, her voice sharp with anger. "What kind of proof could possibly satisfy you?" "Evidence that you're living as husband and wife," Mrs. Pruitt said, her words dripping with implication. "Not as employer and employee playing house. Evidence that this marriage is being consummated." The crudeness of it, the invasion of it, struck Sarah like a physical blow. Beside her, Ethan had gone absolutely rigid, his hands clenched into fists. "How dare you?" he said, his voice low and furious. "How dare you come to my home and demand details of my private life? Our marriage is none of your concern." "It becomes our concern when a child's welfare is at stake," Judge Morrison interjected. "If this marriage is merely a legal fiction, if you're not truly living as man and wife, then the original concerns about propriety remain valid." Sheriff Garrett finally spoke up, his voice apologetic but firm. "Ethan, they've got a point, legally speaking. A marriage that's not consummated can be annulled. And if it's annulled, all the protections it provides for grace disappear." Sarah felt the trap closing around them. These people wouldn't be satisfied until they'd humiliated her completely, until they'd proven that she was exactly what they'd always believed, a woman of questionable morals who'd seduced a grieving widower for her own gain. "You want proof?" Ethan's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. "Fine. We'll give you proof." He turned to Sarah, and she saw determination in his eyes, along with something that looked like apology. Before she could process what was happening, Ethan's arm came around her waist, pulling her close. His other hand cupped her face, and his lips descended on hers in a kiss that was nothing like the chaste performance in the church. This kiss was claiming, possessive, designed to leave no doubt in anyone's mind about the nature of their relationship. Sarah gasped against his mouth, and Ethan used the opportunity to deepen the kiss, his tongue sweeping against hers in a way that sent heat flooding through her entire body. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathing hard. Sarah's knees felt weak, her mind spinning. Ethan kept his arm around her waist, holding her steady, and turned to face their accusers with blazing eyes. "Is that proof enough?" he demanded. "Or do you need us to perform for you right here on the porch?" Several of the council members looked distinctly uncomfortable. Even Margaret Pruitt had the grace to appear somewhat abashed. But the judge was unmoved. A kiss proves nothing, Mallory. We need evidence of cohabitation, evidence that you're sharing a bedroom, living as a married couple in every sense of the word. You want us to share a bedroom? Ethan's laugh was bitter. Fine, we'll share a bedroom, my bedroom, the master bedroom, starting tonight. Will that satisfy your perverted need for details about my private life? Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Share a bedroom, sleep in the same bed. With Ethan. The man whose kiss had just turned her entire world upside down, whose touch made her forget every promise she'd made to herself about keeping this arrangement professional. We'll need verification, the judge said. Weekly visits to ensure the arrangement is being maintained. You'll get no such thing, Ethan snarled. You've pushed far enough, Morrison. I'll move into the master bedroom with my wife, and the whole household will know it. The ranch hands, the servants, everyone. That will have to be enough because I'll be damned if I let you set foot in my bedroom to verify anything. Sheriff Garrett held up his hands placatingly. Ethan's right, Judge. We can't demand that kind of access, but if the household confirms they're living as man and wife, that should satisfy the legal requirements. The judge looked as if he wanted to argue, but even he seemed to recognize he'd reached the limits of his authority. Very well. But understand this, Mallory. If we receive any reports suggesting this marriage is a fraud, we'll be back. And next time we will remove the child, legal standing or not. Get off my property, Ethan said, his voice deadly quiet. And don't come back unless you have a warrant. Sheriff, you're welcome any time, but the rest of these vultures can stay in town where they belong. The delegation mounted their horses, Margaret Pruitt shooting one last disapproving look over her shoulder. As they rode away, Sarah felt Ethan's arm drop from around her waist, felt the sudden cold where his warmth had been. I'm sorry, he said immediately, not meeting her eyes. I shouldn't have. That kiss was inappropriate. I just needed them to believe. It's fine, Sarah interrupted, her voice shakier than she'd like. You did what you had to do. Did I? Ethan finally looked at her, and the anguish in his eyes made her chest tighten. Because now we're trapped, Sarah. Now we have to share a bedroom, have to convince everyone we're truly married, have to live a lie that's becoming more complicated by the minute. Is it a lie? The question escaped before Sarah could stop it. That kiss, Ethan, the way you looked at me in the garden, the way you hold my hand when you think I'm not paying attention. If this is all pretend, you're doing a damn good job of making it feel real. Ethan's jaw clenched. Sarah, don't. Don't make this more than it is. We agreed to a marriage of convenience, Sarah said, her courage rising with her frustration. We agreed to protect Grace, but somewhere along the way, something changed. You feel it too. I know you do. What I feel doesn't matter, Ethan said roughly. I loved Catherine. I will always love Catherine. I can't replace her with... I'm not asking you to replace her. Sarah's voice rose, all the emotions of the past weeks finally boiling over. I'm not asking you to forget her or stop loving her. I'm just asking you to be honest about what's happening between us, about what we're becoming to each other. And what are we becoming? Ethan demanded. Tell me, Sarah, because I don't know. I don't know how to do this. How to love someone new without feeling like I'm betraying everything I had before. The word, love, hung in the air between them like a grenade waiting to explode. Sarah saw the moment Ethan realized what he'd said, saw panic flash across his face. I didn't mean, he started, but Sarah cut him off. Yes, you did, and that's what terrifies you, isn't it? Not that you might fail me or Grace, not that you might not be able to protect us, but that you might actually love us, that you might move forward, that you might be happy again despite everything you've lost. Ethan stared at her, his chest heaving, his hands shaking slightly. I don't know how to be happy anymore, Sarah. I've forgotten how. And I'm afraid, his voice cracked. I'm afraid that if I let myself feel anything real for you, if I let myself love you the way I'm starting to, it'll be taken away again. That I'll lose you like I lost them, and this time it'll destroy me completely. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She crossed to him, placed her hands on his chest, felt his heart racing beneath her palms. You can't live your life in fear of loss, Ethan. None of us are guaranteed tomorrow, but we have today. We have this moment. And I'd rather have whatever time we get together, even if it's brief, than spend the rest of my life wondering what we could have been. You're asking me to risk everything, Ethan whispered. I'm asking you to live, Sarah replied. Really live. Not just exist in the shadow of grief, but step into the light with me. Take the risk. Choose love even when it's terrifying. Ethan's hands came up to cover hers, pressing them firmly against his chest. And if I can't? If I'm too broken, too damaged by what I've been through? Then we'll be broken together, Sarah said. And maybe, piece by piece, we'll figure out how to be whole again. The sound of small feet on the stairs made them both turn. Grace appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes, Molly dragging behind her. Why are you fighting? She asked, her voice small and worried. Sarah and Ethan exchanged glances, both recognizing how their raised voices must have sounded to a child who'd already experienced too much instability in her young life. We're not fighting, sweetheart, Sarah said gently, moving to kneel beside Grace. We're just talking about grown-up things, about feelings that are complicated. Are you sad? Grace asked Ethan directly. Ethan seemed to struggle with the answer, his face working through emotions. Finally, he knelt beside Sarah, bringing himself to Grace's level. I am sad sometimes, he admitted. I miss people I loved who aren't here anymore, but I'm also happy, because I have you and your mama now, and that makes the sad parts easier to carry. Grace considered this with her usual seriousness. Mama says it's okay to be sad and happy at the same time. She says our hearts are big enough for lots of feelings. Your mama is very wise, Ethan said, his eyes finding Sarah's over Grace's head. Are you still going to be my papa? Grace asked, vulnerability creeping into her voice. Even when you're sad? Even when you remember Emma? Ethan's face crumpled, and he pulled Grace into his arms, holding her tight. Always, sweetheart. I'll always be your papa. Nothing will change that. Not sadness, not memories, not anything. Sarah watched them, this man and this child who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances, and felt her heart expand with love so fierce it was almost painful. She loved them both, loved Grace with every fiber of her being, as she always had, and loved Ethan, this broken, beautiful man, in a way that terrified and exhilarated her all at once. When Ethan released Grace, the little girl looked between her parents with a child's uncanny ability to sense when important things were happening. Are we going to be okay? She asked. Yes, Sarah and Ethan said together, their voices overlapping, creating a harmony neither had expected. We're going to be okay, Ethan repeated, reaching out to include Sarah in the embrace. All of us. Together. That night, after Grace was settled in bed with Molly tucked beside her, Sarah stood in the master bedroom and felt the weight of what was about to happen. Ethan's things were already there. They'd always been there, just unused. But now her things were there too, moved from her old room at Ethan's insistence, creating a space that belonged to both of them. The bed loomed large in the center of the room, the bed Ethan had shared with Catherine, the bed where his first marriage had lived and breathed and created life. Sarah touched the quilt tentatively, wondering if she had any right to be here, to claim this space. We can get new linens, Ethan's voice came from the doorway, making her jump. New everything if you want. I should have thought of it before, should have realized this would be strange for you. Sarah turned to find him standing there in his nightshirt, his hair still damp from washing, looking younger and more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him. It's not strange, she said. It's just significant. This room holds so much history. Too much history, Ethan agreed. He moved into the room but kept his distance from the bed, from her. Sarah, about earlier, the things I said, did you mean them? She asked directly. Ethan's throat worked as he swallowed. Every word, which is why I'm terrified. So am I, Sarah admitted. I never thought I'd feel this way about anyone after Thomas. Never thought my heart had room for another love. But here we are. Here we are, Ethan echoed. He took a step closer, then another, until he was standing directly in front of her. I don't know how to do this, Sarah. Don't know how to be a husband again, especially to someone who isn't Catherine, Sarah finished gently. I know, and I'm not trying to be her. I'm just trying to be me. Trying to figure out how to be your wife in my own way. Ethan's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "I'm starting to fall in love with you," he said, the words sounding like a confession and a revelation all at once. "I've been fighting it, trying to convince myself it's just gratitude or loneliness or some twisted attempt to recreate what I lost. But it's none of those things. It's real, and it's terrifying." Sarah's breath caught. "Ethan, I can't promise I won't mess this up," he continued, his eyes searching hers desperately. "Can't promise I won't compare, won't grieve, won't sometimes wish things were different, but I can promise I'll try. I'll try to love you the way you deserve, to be the husband and father we both need me to be." Sarah's hands came up to cover his, holding his touch against her face. "That's all I'm asking. Just try. Just let yourself feel what you're feeling without guilt, without fear. Let yourself be happy, Ethan. Please." He leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away, to refuse. But Sarah didn't refuse. She lifted her face to his, and when their lips met, it was different from every kiss before. This wasn't for show, wasn't panic or performance. This was choice. This was truth. This was love. The kiss deepened, became something more urgent, more desperate. Ethan's arms came around her, pulling her close, and Sarah melted into him, into the warmth and strength of him, into the promise of what they could become together. His hands trembled as they moved over her back, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. She was his. She was choosing him despite all his broken pieces. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "I don't know if I can... Tonight," he struggled with the words. "I want to. God, I want to. But this bed, this room..." "I know," Sarah whispered. "We don't have to do anything you're not ready for. We can just sleep, just be together. That's enough." Relief flooded Ethan's face. "You're sure? After everything the judge said, after all the pressure, I'm sure. This marriage is real, Ethan. Real in the ways that matter. And if we need time to figure out the rest, then we'll take that time. Together." They climbed into bed from opposite sides, the space between them feeling vast despite the intimacy they'd just shared. Sarah lay on her back, staring at the ceiling, acutely aware of Ethan beside her, of his breathing, of the warmth radiating from his body. "Sarah?" Ethan's voice came through the darkness. "Yes? Can I hold you? Just hold you. Nothing more. I just need to know you're real, that this is real." Sarah's answer was to roll toward him, to fit herself against his side, her head finding the hollow of his shoulder as naturally as if she'd been doing it for years. Ethan's arm came around her, pulling her close, and she felt the tension drain from his body as he held her. "Thank you," he whispered into her hair, "for not giving up on me, for seeing something worth saving beneath all the grief and fear." "Thank you for letting me in," Sarah replied, "for taking the risk, for choosing to live again." They lay there in the darkness, two broken people learning to be whole together, and Sarah felt something shift in the house around them. The ghosts were still there. They'd always be there, but they didn't feel quite so heavy anymore. Catherine and Emma's presence felt less like a haunting and more like a blessing, as if they were giving their permission for this new family to grow in the space they'd left behind. Sarah's eyes grew heavy, lulled by the steady beat of Ethan's heart beneath her ear, by the warmth of his embrace, by the sense of safety she hadn't felt since Thomas died. As she drifted towards sleep, she heard Ethan speak one more time, his voice barely audible. "I love you, Sarah Mallory. God help me, but I love you." Sarah smiled against his chest, too close to sleep to form words, but she squeezed his hand where it rested on her waist, hoped he understood that she loved him too, that despite everything, the grief, the complications, the impossible circumstances that had brought them together, she loved him with a fierceness that surprised her. Morning would bring new challenges. The town would still gossip. Judge Morrison would still look for reasons to condemn them, and they'd still have to navigate the complicated waters of blending a family from broken pieces. But tonight, in this bed where love had lived before and was learning to live again, they had each other. And for now, that was enough. The days that followed took on a new rhythm, one that felt both strange and right. Ethan no longer retreated to the bunkhouse at night. Instead, he came home, truly home, to the house that was beginning to feel less like a tomb and more like a sanctuary. He and Sarah moved around each other with increasing comfort, learning each other's habits and quirks, building the small intimacies that defined a marriage. Grace blossomed under the attention of two parents who adored her. She helped Sarah in the kitchen, learned to ride with Ethan, filled the house with laughter and questions and the particular joy that only children can bring. And when she called Ethan Papa, now, no one flinched. It had become as natural as breathing. 3 weeks after their wedding, Sarah was hanging laundry when she saw riders approaching. Her stomach clenched automatically. Visitors never seemed to bring good news. But as they drew closer, she recognized Sheriff Garrett, alone, without the judge or any delegation. Ethan emerged from the barn, his face guarded as he watched the sheriff approach. Sarah moved to stand beside him, a united front, and felt his hand find hers automatically. "Ethan, Mrs. Mallory." Sheriff Garrett tipped his hat, then dismounted with a weariness that spoke of a long ride. "I come bearing news, some of it good, some of it complicated." "Let's hear it," Ethan said. The sheriff pulled a folded document from his coat. "Judge Morrison has dropped all legal challenges to your custody of Grace. The marriage has been verified as legitimate by multiple witnesses, and there's no grounds for further investigation." Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief. "They're really done? No more inspections? No more threats?" "They're done," Sheriff Garrett confirmed. Then his expression grew more serious. "But there's something else. The county home, the place they were threatening to send Grace, it burned down 2 nights ago." Sarah gasped. "Were there children inside?" 13 of them, all dead, along with 2 caretakers. The sheriff's voice was heavy with grief and anger. The building was a fire trap, no proper exits, bars on the windows, overcrowded beyond belief. The fire started in the kitchen, and by the time anyone realized what was happening, it was too late. Ethan had gone absolutely white, his hand crushing Sarah's. 13 children, he repeated, his voice hollow. "If Grace had been placed there," Sheriff Garrett continued quietly, "she would have been in that building, would have been—" He stopped, unable to finish. Sarah felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Grace could have died. If they hadn't married, if Ethan hadn't defied the town, if they hadn't found a way to make this work, Grace would have been in that building when it burned. Just like Emma. Just like Catherine. "Judge Morrison wanted me to tell you," the sheriff said. "He's not a man who apologizes easily, but he asked me to convey that he realizes now you were right. About everything." 13 children, Ethan said again, his voice breaking. 13 lives that could have been saved if someone had just listened, just cared enough to see what was right in front of them. The sheriff nodded grimly. "There's going to be an investigation, changes made, but it's too late for those children." He paused, then added, "The town's changed too, Ethan. People are seeing things differently now. Seeing what you did, saving Grace, fighting for her, in a new light. You're not the hermit anymore. You're the man who stood up when it mattered, who protected a child when no one else would." After the sheriff left, Ethan stood frozen in the yard, staring at nothing. Sarah wanted to comfort him, but wasn't sure how, wasn't sure if there were words for what he was feeling, the horror of what could have been, the guilt of survival, the terrible validation of his worst fears about the world's cruelty. "Grace!" The shout tore from Ethan's throat, desperate and afraid. Grace came running from the house, sensing panic. "Papa, what's wrong?" Ethan dropped to his knees and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight Sarah worried he might hurt her. But Grace just wrapped her small arms around his neck and held on, somehow understanding that he needed this, needed the tangible proof that she was safe, she was alive, she was his. "Don't ever leave me," Ethan choked out. "Don't ever. I can't lose you. I can't." "I won't, Papa," Grace promised, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "I'm right here. I'm always going to be right here." Sarah knelt beside them both, her arms coming around them, creating a circle of protection and love. This family, this impossible, imperfect, beautiful family, had been forged in fire and grief and desperate hope. They'd survived when they shouldn't have, loved when they thought they couldn't, built something real from the ruins of their separate tragedies. And now, holding each other in the Kansas sunshine, they understood just how precious that was, how fragile, how worth fighting for. "We're safe," Sarah whispered, to Ethan, to Grace, to herself. "We're together, and we're safe." and that's all that matters. Ethan lifted his head, his eyes red but clear. I love you both so much it terrifies me. The thought of losing either of you. Then don't think about it, Sarah said firmly. Think about today, about this moment, about how we have each other right now. Grace pulled back just enough to look at both her parents. Are you going to be sad again, Papa? Ethan touched her face with infinite tenderness. Probably sometimes, sweetheart, but mostly I'm going to be grateful. Grateful that I found you and your mama. Grateful that we're a family. Grateful for every single day we get together. Good, Grace pronounced. Then, with the perfect timing of a child, she squirmed free and announced, I'm hungry. Can we have lunch? The absurd normalcy of it, the way life continued even in the face of tragedy and revelation, made both adults laugh through their tears. They stood together, dusty and emotional, and holding each other up, and walked back toward the house that had finally, truly become a home. That night, after Grace was asleep, Sarah and Ethan sat on the porch watching the stars emerge. They didn't speak for a long time, content just to be together, to process the day's revelations in comfortable silence. Finally, Ethan spoke. I was wrong, he said quietly, about so many things. I thought loving again meant betraying Catherine and Emma. I thought moving forward meant leaving them behind, but it doesn't, does it? No, Sarah agreed. They're part of you, part of our story. They always will be. I want to tell Grace about them, Ethan said. Really tell her. Not just the bare facts, but the stories, the memories, the love. I want her to know Emma, to understand that being her papa doesn't erase the daughter I had before. I think that's beautiful, Sarah said softly, and I want to tell her about Thomas too, about the man who was her first father, who loved her before she was even born. Ethan turned to her, reached for her hand. We're building something remarkable here, aren't we? A family that honors the past while embracing the future. A love that doesn't compete with what came before but exists alongside it. Yes, Sarah said. We are. Ethan pulled her close, and she settled against his side as naturally as breathing. Thank you, he whispered into her hair, for seeing past the broken man I was, for having the courage to love me anyway, for giving me a reason to live instead of just exist. Thank you for saving us, Sarah replied, for taking the risk, for letting us into your haunted heart and making room for us there. They sat together under the vast Kansas sky, two souls that had found each other in the darkest of times and somehow created light. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new moments of both grief and grace. But tonight, they had each other. They had Grace. They had this home they'd built from broken pieces. And that, Sarah thought, as Ethan's lips found hers in a kiss that promised forever, was more than enough. It was everything. The weeks that followed the sheriff's revelation brought an unexpected peace to the Mallory ranch. Sarah watched it settle over Ethan like morning dew on prairie grass. Subtle, gradual, but unmistakably real. He smiled more easily now, laughed without the shadow of guilt crossing his face, held her in Grace without the constant fear that happiness would be ripped away again. But peace, Sarah had learned, was a fragile thing in Kansas. It could be shattered by a single moment, a single choice, a single truth left unspoken for too long. That truth arrived on a crisp October morning when Sarah stood at the kitchen window, her hand pressed unconsciously to her abdomen. She'd suspected for weeks now, had felt the telltale signs she remembered from carrying Grace, the bone-deep exhaustion, the queasiness that came and went like tides, the tenderness that made her flinch when Ethan embraced her too tightly. She was pregnant. The realization should have filled her with joy. Instead, it terrified her. This child would bind her and Ethan together in ways that went beyond vows and legal documents. This child would be his in a way Grace never could be, would carry his blood, would be the continuation of the Mallory line that had died with Emma. And Sarah had no idea how to tell him. "Mama, you look funny," Grace's voice pulled her from her spiraling thoughts. The little girl stood in the doorway, Molly dangling from one hand, her face scrunched with concern. "Are you sick?" "Just tired, sweetheart," Sarah said, forcing a smile. "Nothing to worry about." But Grace, perceptive as always, wasn't convinced. She moved closer, her small hand reaching up to touch Sarah's forehead, the way Sarah always checked her for fever. "You've been tired a lot lately, and yesterday you didn't eat breakfast. Papa noticed too. He told Jack he was worried about you." Sarah's heart clenched. Of course Ethan had noticed. He noticed everything about her now, every mood shift, every quiet moment, every time she pushed food around her plate instead of eating. Their intimacy had grown beyond the physical, beyond the emotional, into something deeper. They were learning to read each other the way long-married couples did, to sense the unspoken, to feel what the other felt, which meant she couldn't hide this much longer. The sound of boots on the porch announced Ethan's return from the morning chores. He came through the door with his usual energy, his face lighting up when he saw them, then clouding with concern when he caught sight of Sarah's expression. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately, crossing to her side. "Sarah, you're pale. Are you feeling all right?" "I'm fine," she said automatically, but the words rang hollow, even to her own ears. Ethan's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone with infinite gentleness. "You're not fine. You haven't been fine for days. Talk to me, please." Sarah looked at Grace, who watched them with wide, worried eyes. This wasn't a conversation to have in front of their daughter, not until she knew how Ethan would react, what this would mean for them. "Grace, sweetheart, why don't you go play with Molly in the parlor? Papa and I need to talk about grown-up things." Grace's lower lip trembled. "Are you fighting again? Are you going to stop being a family?" "No, baby, no." Sarah knelt down, ignoring the wave of nausea the quick movement triggered. "We're not fighting. We're never going to stop being a family. I just need to talk to Papa alone for a few minutes, okay?" Grace nodded reluctantly and trudged toward the parlor, casting worried glances over her shoulder. When she was gone, Ethan turned to Sarah with storm-gray eyes full of concern and something that looked like fear. "Tell me," he said simply. "Whatever it is, just tell me. The not knowing is worse than any truth could be." Sarah took a shaking breath, her hands unconsciously moving to her stomach again. Ethan's eyes followed the gesture, and she saw understanding dawn on his face with the force of a lightning strike. "Sarah," he breathed, his voice rough with emotion she couldn't decipher. Are you with child?" The words hung between them, heavy with implication, with history, with the ghost of another pregnancy, another child, another life that had ended in flames and grief. Sarah watched Ethan's face cycle through a dozen emotions: shock, joy, terror, something that looked almost like anguish. "Yes," she whispered. "I'm fairly certain. All the signs are there. I carried Grace. I know what it feels like, and—" Her voice broke. "Ethan, I'm sorry. I know this complicates everything. I know this isn't what we planned." "Sorry?" Ethan's voice cracked on the word. "Sarah, you're carrying my child, and you're apologizing?" He moved toward her, his hands hovering as if he wanted to touch her but was afraid she might break. "How long have you known?" "I suspected about 2 weeks ago, but I wasn't sure until a few days ago, and I didn't know how to tell you. Didn't know if you'd be happy or angry or—" Sarah felt tears streaming down her face now, all the fear and uncertainty of the past weeks pouring out. "After everything with Emma, after losing her, I didn't know if you could handle this, if the thought of another child would bring back all the grief, all the fear of losing someone else you love." Ethan's face crumpled, and he pulled Sarah into his arms with a desperation that spoke of every emotion warring inside him. "Of course I'm afraid," he said roughly against her hair. "I'm terrified. The thought of you carrying our child, of something happening to you, to the baby, it's bringing back everything. Every nightmare I've lived through, every loss I've suffered. But Sarah, I'm also—" His voice broke completely. "I'm also happier than I have any right to be. We're going to have a baby. Our baby. A child born of this love we've built from broken pieces." Sarah pulled back just enough to see his face, to read the truth in his eyes. What she saw there took her breath away, joy and terror in equal measure. Yes, but also wonder. Pure, unfiltered wonder at the miracle of life beginning again in a house that had known so much death. "You're happy?" she asked, needing to hear it again. "I'm terrified and happy and grateful and scared out of my mind," Ethan said, his hands cupping her face with a tenderness that made her chest ache. "But mostly, I'm in awe of you, of us, of the fact that life keeps finding ways to grow even in the hardest soil." He kissed her then, soft and reverent, his hands moving to her still flat abdomen with a touch so gentle it might have been a prayer. "Our child," he murmured against her lips. "Yours and mine. A new life, a new hope, a new chance to get it right." "And if we don't get it right?" Sarah asked, voicing the fear that had kept her awake for nights. "If something goes wrong, if I can't, then we face it together," Ethan said firmly. "Just like we've faced everything else. Together, Sarah. Always together." A sound from the doorway made them both turn. Grace stood there, her face a mixture of confusion and hope. "Is everything okay? You're crying, but you're also smiling. I don't understand." Ethan looked at Sarah, a question in his eyes. She nodded, and he held out his hand to Grace. "Come here, sweetheart. We have something to tell you." Grace approached cautiously, Molly clutched tight against her chest. Ethan lifted her into his arms, settling her on his hip while keeping one arm around Sarah. They stood there together, this family of 3, soon to be 4, and Ethan's voice was warm with love as he spoke. "Grace, you're going to be a big sister. Your mama's going to have a baby." Grace's eyes went wide. "A real baby? That will live here with us?" "A real baby," Sarah confirmed, smoothing Grace's hair back from her face. "In about 6 months, there will be a new little person in our family. Someone who will need you to teach them things, to help take care of them, to be the best big sister you can be." Grace's face transformed with wonder. "Like how Papa teaches me about horses? And how you teach me about cooking? I can teach the baby things?" "Exactly like that," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. Grace was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. Then her small hand reached out to touch Sarah's stomach with infinite gentleness. "Hello, baby," she said softly. "I'm your big sister Grace. I'm going to take very good care of you. And I'll share Molly with you sometimes, but not all the time because she's still mine. But I'll share everything else. I promise." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face again, but these were different tears. Tears of joy, of relief, of overwhelming love for this child who'd already lost so much but still had such capacity for generosity and hope. Ethan kissed the top of Grace's head, then Sarah's forehead, then pressed his hand over Grace's where it rested on Sarah's abdomen. "We're going to take care of all of us," he said. "All 4 of us. This family we've built from nothing, from grief and hunger and desperate hope. It's growing. It's becoming something beautiful." The next weeks brought changes both subtle and profound. Ethan became almost obsessively protective of Sarah, hovering whenever she moved too quickly, insisting she rest more, eat more, do less. At first, Sarah found it endearing. Then it became suffocating. "Ethan, I'm pregnant, not dying," she finally snapped one afternoon when he'd tried to prevent her from lifting a basket of laundry. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I'm perfectly capable of doing my normal work." Ethan's face tightened with barely controlled fear. Catherine said the same thing. She kept working, kept pushing herself, right up until... He stopped, shook his head. "I can't lose you, Sarah. I won't survive it." Understanding flooded through Sarah. This wasn't about her being fragile. This was about Ethan's terror, about the memories of his first wife continuing to work while pregnant, continuing to live her normal life right up until the moment fate had stolen her away. In Ethan's mind, any deviation from complete caution was a risk he couldn't bear. Sarah set down the laundry basket and took Ethan's hands in hers. "Look at me," she said firmly. When his storm-gray eyes met hers, she saw the raw fear there, the old wounds torn open by new vulnerability. "I am not Catherine. This pregnancy is not that pregnancy. And this house isn't going to burn, Ethan. It's not going to take me away from you." "You can't know that," Ethan said roughly. "You can't promise that. Catherine couldn't promise it either, and look what happened." "You're right. I can't promise that nothing will go wrong, but I can promise that I'll be careful, that I'll listen to my body, rest when I need to, ask for help when I need it, and I need you to promise me something too. Anything. Promise me you won't let fear steal the joy from this. Promise me you'll let yourself be happy about this baby, excited about the future, instead of constantly waiting for disaster to strike." Sarah squeezed his hands. "Our child deserves a father who isn't paralyzed by what-ifs. And I deserve a husband who trusts that we're going to be okay." Ethan closed his eyes, his jaw working as he fought for control. I'm trying, Sarah. God knows I'm trying. But every time I look at you, every time I think about the baby, I see Catherine and Emma. I see everything I lost, everything that was taken from me, and I'm terrified it's going to happen again. Then let's make new memories, Sarah said. Let's fill this house with so much love and life that the old grief can't suffocate the new joy. Let's choose to believe in the future instead of being prisoners of the past. Slowly, painfully, Ethan nodded. He pulled Sarah into his arms, holding her with a desperation that spoke of every fear he carried, every loss he'd endured. I love you, he whispered fiercely. I love you and Grace and this baby more than I ever thought I could love again. And that love, it's the most terrifying thing I've ever felt. Love is supposed to be terrifying, Sarah replied, her arms tight around him. It means you have something to lose, but it also means you have something worth fighting for, something worth living for. They stood there in the kitchen, holding each other as if their embrace alone could keep disaster at bay, could protect them from the cruel randomness of fate. And maybe, Sarah thought, maybe it could. Maybe love was its own kind of shield, its own kind of strength. The town's reaction to Sarah's pregnancy was complicated. Some, like Mrs. Patterson from the Double Creek Ranch, were genuinely happy, bringing gifts and advice and warm congratulations. Others, like Margaret Pruitt, seemed almost disappointed that the marriage had proven so thoroughly real, so completely consummated. Well, Mrs. Pruitt said when she encountered Sarah at the general store, her eyes fixed pointedly on Sarah's slowly rounding belly. I suppose this settles any questions about the legitimacy of your union, though one might say it's rather quick. Sarah, who'd developed a spine of steel through months of defending herself and her family, met Mrs. Pruitt's judgmental gaze without flinching. One might say a lot of things, Mrs. Pruitt, but the only opinions that matter to me are those of my husband and daughter. Everyone else can think what they like. Jonas Morrison, who'd been listening from behind the counter, actually smiled. His attitude towards Sarah had shifted dramatically since that day in his store when Ethan had raged at him, when Grace had nearly died in front of them all. Now he treated Sarah with a respect that bordered on deference. Congratulations, Mrs. Mallory, he said warmly. The whole town's happy for you and Ethan. Well, most of the town, he added with a pointed glance at Mrs. Pruitt. It's good to see life coming back to the Mallory Ranch. Good to see Ethan living again instead of just existing. Sarah felt warmth bloom in her chest at the genuine kindness in Morrison's voice. The town was changing, just as the sheriff had said. People were beginning to see past their prejudices, past their assumptions, to the truth of what Sarah and Ethan had built together. She was loading her purchases into the wagon when she heard hoofbeats approaching at speed. Ethan appeared around the corner, his face tight with worry, relaxing only when he saw Sarah safe and whole. Jack said you'd come to town alone, he said, dismounting quickly. Sarah, in your condition, you shouldn't be… Ethan Mallory, we talked about this, Sarah interrupted, but there was more affection than annoyance in her voice. I'm perfectly capable of driving a wagon to town and back. The baby isn't due for 5 months. I'm not made of glass. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, looking chagrined. I know you're not. But when Jack mentioned you'd gone alone, I needed to see for myself that you were all right. Sarah's irritation melted at the vulnerability in his voice, the fear that still lurked beneath his attempts at calm. She reached up and touched his face, feeling the slight stubble there, the warmth of his skin. I'm all right. We're all right. All three of us. Ethan's hand covered hers, pressing it more firmly against his cheek. I'm being ridiculous, aren't I? Hovering like a mother hen, seeing danger where there isn't any. You're being a man who's loved and lost, Sarah said gently. A man who's learning to love again, despite the fear. That's not ridiculous. It's brave. It doesn't feel brave. It feels like drowning while trying to pretend I can swim. Sarah smiled softly. Then it's a good thing you're not swimming alone anymore. We're in this together, remember? When the water gets too deep for you, I'll help you float. And when it's too deep for me, you'll do the same. Ethan pulled her close as her growing belly would allow, and pressed his forehead against hers. How did I get so lucky? How did I deserve someone like you walking into Morrison's store that day, desperate and beautiful and strong enough to save me while I was saving you. We saved each other, Sarah corrected. That's what love does. It saves us from ourselves, from our fears, from the loneliness that tries to convince us we're better off alone. They stood there on Silverton's main street, holding each other in full view of anyone who cared to look. And Sarah didn't care one bit about propriety or judgment or what Mrs. Pruitt might say. This man was her husband, the father of her children, the love she'd thought she'd never find again. Let the whole world see how much she cherished him. Winter came to the Kansas prairie with its usual harshness, bringing snow that transformed the landscape into something stark and beautiful. Sarah's belly grew round and prominent, and Grace spent hours talking to her little sibling through Sarah's skin, telling stories and singing songs and making promises about all the things they'd do together. Christmas approached, and Sarah suggested they make it special. Grace has never had a real Christmas, she explained to Ethan one evening as they sat by the fire. The past 2 years, we had nothing. Before that, when Thomas was alive, we were too poor for much celebration. I want this year to be different. I want her to have memories of magic and joy. Ethan's expression grew distant. Catherine loved Christmas. She'd decorate every inch of the house, bake for days, make Emma's gifts with her own hands. He paused, pain flickering across his features. The Christmas after they died, I didn't even acknowledge it, just let the day pass like any other. Then this Christmas we'll make new traditions, Sarah said, ones that honor the past but belong to our future. Grace deserves that. So does our baby. On Christmas Eve, they cut down a pine tree from the north pasture, Grace riding on Ethan's shoulders and declaring herself the official tree inspector. They decorated it with strings of popcorn Grace helped make, with paper ornaments the three of them cut and painted together, with Catherine's beautiful glass baubles that Ethan retrieved from storage with hands that only trembled slightly. She'd want them used, he said as he hung a delicate angel on a high branch. Want them to bring joy to another child, another Christmas. That night, after Grace was finally asleep, dizzy with excitement about what morning might bring, Sarah and Ethan sat before the fire, her head on his shoulder, his hand resting on her rounded belly. I feel the baby move sometimes now, Sarah said softly. Little flutters, like butterflies. Ethan's hand pressed more firmly against her abdomen, his face intent. Can you feel it now? Be patient. The baby doesn't perform on command. They waited in comfortable silence, the fire crackling, the house settling around them with its familiar creaks and sighs. Then, there, a small flutter beneath Ethan's palm, barely perceptible but unmistakably real. Ethan's breath caught. I felt it. Sarah, I felt our baby move. The wonder in his voice, the pure, uncomplicated joy, made Sarah's eyes fill with tears. This was what she'd wanted for him, this ability to feel happiness without the shadow of grief, to embrace the future without being paralyzed by the past. Our baby, Ethan repeated, his voice rough with emotion. Our child, who's going to grow up in this house, with Grace as a sister, with all the love we can give. With all the love Catherine and Emma left behind, waiting to be given to someone new. He shifted to kneel before Sarah, his hands cradling her face. Thank you, he said fiercely. Thank you for this gift, for Grace, for this baby, for teaching me how to live again, how to love again, how to believe the future could hold something besides grief. Ethan, no, let me finish. When I walked into Morrison's store that day and saw Grace dying, I thought I was saving you. But you saved me, Sarah. You and Grace, you pulled me out of a darkness I didn't even realize I was drowning in. And now, with this baby coming, with our family growing, I'm not just existing anymore. I'm living, really, truly living. Sarah pulled him up beside her, kissed him with all the love and gratitude and hope in her heart. We saved each other, she whispered against his lips, and we're going to keep saving each other every day for the rest of our lives. They made love that night with a tenderness born of deep knowing, of bodies and hearts that had learned each other's rhythms, each other's needs. Ethan was infinitely gentle with her changing body, reverent in his touches, worshipful in his kisses. And Sarah gave herself to him completely, holding nothing back, loving him with a fierceness that still sometimes surprised her. Afterward, as they lay tangled together, Ethan's hand never left her belly, as if he could protect their child through sheer force of will. "Boy or girl?" he asked. "What do you think?" "I think it doesn't matter," Sarah replied. "As long as the baby is healthy. As long as we're all safe." "If it's a girl, I'd like to name her Catherine Emma," Ethan said quietly, "after them both, to honor them, to keep their memory alive." Sarah's throat tightened. "And if it's a boy?" "Thomas," Ethan said without hesitation, "after the man who loved you first, who gave you grace, who would want to be remembered." The generosity of it, the way he honored her past as much as his own, made Sarah's heart swell with love so intense it was almost painful. "Those are beautiful names," she managed. "Perfect names." Christmas morning brought squeals of delight from Grace, who found a new doll under the tree. Not a replacement for Molly, but a companion. She found a wooden horse carved by Ethan's own hands, painted with painstaking care. She found a new dress Sarah had sewn in secret, with lace and ribbons that made her look like a little princess. But the greatest gift, Sarah thought as she watched Ethan swing Grace into the air, both of them laughing with pure joy, was this family, this love, this second chance they'd all been given at happiness. The new year brought new challenges. Sarah's pregnancy advanced, her body growing heavy and unwieldy. She tired more easily now, needed help with tasks that had once been simple. And Ethan, true to his word, was trying to balance protection with trust, hovering less even as his fear remained constant. In late January, on a night when the wind howled across the prairie and snow piled against the windows, Sarah woke to a familiar pain. She lay still for a moment, hand on her belly, timing the contractions. They were still far apart, still manageable, but there was no mistaking what they meant. The baby was coming. "Ethan," she said, shaking his shoulder gently. "Ethan, wake up." He came awake instantly, the way he always did now, hypervigilant to any sign of distress. "What is it? What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. But the baby, I think it's time." The color drained from Ethan's face. "Time? Now? But you're not due for another 3 weeks. Babies come when they're ready, not when we expect them." Sarah sat up slowly, breathing through another contraction. "We need to send for the midwife. Mrs. Patterson said she'd help when the time came." Ethan was already moving, pulling on clothes with shaking hands. "I'll ride for her now. And the doctor, we should get the doctor too, in case—" "Ethan." Sarah's calm voice cut through his panic. "Take a breath. We have time. The contractions are still far apart. Send Jack for Mrs. Patterson and the doctor. You stay here with me and Grace. But if something happens on the ride, then Jack will handle it. I need you here, Ethan. I need you with me, not riding through a blizzard in a panic." Sarah reached for his hand, squeezed it. "Trust me. Trust that this is going to be all right." Ethan's throat worked as he swallowed hard. "The last time I was in this house during a birth, Catherine." He stopped, couldn't finish. "I am not Catherine," Sarah said for what felt like the 100th time. "And this is not that night. This is our night, our baby, our future. Don't let the past steal this from us." Slowly, Ethan nodded. He bent to kiss her forehead, her lips, her belly where their child waited to enter the world. "All right. I'll send Jack, but I'm not leaving your side, not for anything." The next hours blurred together in a haze of pain and effort. Mrs. Patterson arrived with the doctor, both of them confident and calm despite the storm raging outside. Grace was sent to stay with Jack's wife in the bunkhouse, protected from the raw reality of childbirth, but close enough to be fetched when the baby arrived. Ethan stayed at Sarah's side through it all, holding her hand, wiping her brow, whispering encouragement even as she saw the fear haunting his eyes. He was reliving every moment of Catherine's labor, Sarah knew, comparing, worrying, waiting for something to go catastrophically wrong. "Talk to me," Sarah gasped between contractions. "Tell me something good. Tell me about the future." Ethan's voice was hoarse but steady. "When the baby comes, we're going to introduce them to the horses. Grace will be so proud, showing off her baby brother or sister. And in the spring, we'll plant the garden together, all 4 of us. We'll watch the tulips bloom, the ones Catherine planted that refused to die. Another contraction stole Sarah's ability to hear. The pain was immense, all-consuming, but she focused on Ethan's face, on the love she saw there, on the future he was painting with words. "You're doing so well," Mrs. Patterson's voice cut through the haze. "Almost there, Sarah. Just a little more." "I can't," Sarah sobbed. "I can't do this anymore." "Yes, you can." Ethan's face filled her vision, his hands cradling hers. "You're the strongest person I know. You survived starvation, survived judgment, survived loving a broken man. You can do this. We can do this. Together." Sarah bore down with everything she had, feeling something shift, something give. And then, a cry. Thin, reedy, but unmistakably alive. Unmistakably real. "It's a boy!" Mrs. Patterson announced triumphantly. "A healthy, beautiful boy." Ethan's face crumpled, tears streaming freely as the midwife placed the squalling infant on Sarah's chest. Sarah looked down at her son, their son, and felt her heart expand to accommodate this new, overwhelming love. He was perfect, tiny and red-faced and furious at being thrust into the cold world, but absolutely perfect. "Thomas," Sarah breathed, her fingers tracing the delicate features. "Welcome to the world, Thomas Mallory." Ethan's hands joined hers, touching their son with a reverence that spoke of miracles and second chances. "Thomas," he repeated, his voice breaking on the name. "Our son. Our beautiful son." The doctor finished his examination, pronounced both mother and baby healthy, and began packing his instruments. Mrs. Patterson cleaned and swaddled the baby, then placed him back in Sarah's arms with a knowing smile. "He's a fighter, this one," she said, coming early, in a blizzard, determined to make his entrance on his own terms. "He's going to be just like his mama." When everyone had cleared out, leaving them in the soft lamplight with their newborn son, Ethan climbed carefully into bed beside Sarah. Together they looked down at Thomas, at this tiny person they'd created from love and hope, and the desperate need to move forward. "I was so afraid," Ethan admitted. "The whole time I was terrified I'd lose you like I lost Catherine. That history would repeat itself, that I'd be left alone again with nothing but grief." "But you weren't," Sarah said softly. "We made it through, all three of us." Ethan pressed a kiss to her temple, his arm coming around her shoulders. "Four of us. We can't forget Grace." As if summoned by her name, they heard small footsteps in the hallway. The door cracked open and Grace's face appeared, eyes wide with wonder and a little fear. "Mama, is the baby here? Are you all right?" "Come see, sweetheart," Sarah called softly. "Come meet your baby brother." Grace crept into the room, Jack's wife hovering protectively behind her. She climbed onto the bed with Ethan's help and peered down at the bundle in Sarah's arms. "He's so small," she whispered, her finger reaching out to touch Thomas's tiny hand. The baby's fingers curled reflexively around hers, and Grace's face transformed with wonder. "He's holding my hand. Mama, Papa, he's holding my hand." "That's because he knows you're his big sister," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "He knows you're going to love him and protect him and teach him everything you know." Grace looked up at them, her face serious. "I'm going to be the best big sister ever. I'm going to make sure he's never hungry like I was, never scared, never alone." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. "I know you will, baby. I know you will." They sat there together, all four of them, as the blizzard raged outside and warmth filled the room from within. This family that had been forged in desperation, built on grief, sustained by hope, it was complete now. Not perfect, never perfect, but complete. The weeks that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings, of Grace's enthusiastic help that sometimes made things harder, of Ethan's wonder every time he held his son. Sarah watched him with Thomas and saw the healing happening in real time, the way he could hold the baby without fear consuming him, the way he could plan for the future without waiting for disaster to strike. One evening, when Thomas was 6 weeks old and sleeping peacefully in his cradle, Sarah found Ethan standing in Emma's old room, Grace's room now. He held a photograph in his hands, the one of Catherine and Emma taken that last summer. "I haven't forgotten them," he said without turning around. "I never could. But the grief, It's different now, softer. Like I can remember them with love instead of just pain. Sarah moved to stand beside him, looked at the photograph of the family Ethan had lost. They'd be happy for you, for us, for the family you've built from the ashes of what you lost. Catherine would have loved you, Ethan said, his thumb tracing Catherine's face in the photograph. Would have seen in you what I see, strength and grace and a love fierce enough to save a broken man. And Emma, his voice caught. Emma would have adored being a big sister, would have been so proud of Grace, so gentle with Thomas. They're part of our story, Sarah said, part of who we are, how we got here. We don't have to forget them to move forward. Ethan set the photograph back on the shelf, then turned to Sarah with eyes that held both grief and joy in equal measure. I love you, Sarah Mallory. I love our family. I love the life we've built. And I'm finally able to believe that I deserve this happiness, that it won't be ripped away the moment I stop being vigilant. Sarah wrapped her arms around him, held him close. We deserve this, all of us. And whatever comes, whatever challenges the future brings, we'll face them together, as a family. Spring arrived with its usual drama, painting the prairie in shades of green and gold. The tulips Catherine had planted so long ago bloomed in abundance, joined now by new flowers Sarah and Grace had added to the garden. The ranch flourished under Ethan's capable management, the cattle thrived, and the house that had been a tomb for 3 years rang with laughter and life. On a warm afternoon in May, Sarah sat on the porch with Thomas sleeping against her shoulder, while Grace played in the yard with one of the ranch hand's children. Ethan came around the corner leading a new mare, his face lighting up when he saw his family. She's beautiful, Sarah called, admiring the horse's sleek lines. She's for Grace, Ethan replied, tying the mare to the hitching post. Old enough and gentle enough for a child to ride. I thought it was time she learned properly, instead of just sitting in front of me on my horse. Sarah's heart swelled watching him. This man who'd been so broken, so lost in grief he couldn't function. He was whole again, not unmarked by tragedy, never that, but whole in a way that honored both his past and his present. Grace came running, her face alight with excitement. Is that horse for me? Really, truly for me? Really, truly, Ethan confirmed, swinging her up into his arms. But you have to promise to take care of her, to learn how to ride properly, to be responsible. I promise, Papa. I promise everything. Grace was already squirming to get down, to get closer to her new treasure. Ethan set her down and watched her approach the mare with the careful instruction he'd been teaching her. Sarah moved to stand beside him, Thomas still sleeping peacefully against her. Look at us, she said softly. Look at what we've become. Ethan's arm came around her waist, pulling her close. I know. Sometimes I can't believe this is real, that I get to have this, a wife I love, children who call me Papa, a home that's truly a home again. Believe it, Sarah said, tilting her face up to kiss him. Because it's real, Ethan. This love, this family, this life. It's all real. And it's ours. They stood there together, watching Grace with her new horse, feeling Thomas's gentle breathing, surrounded by the vast Kansas prairie that had witnessed so much pain but now held so much promise. The wind carried the scent of growing things, of life returning, of hope renewed. Silverton's church bells rang in the distance, marking the hour, and Sarah thought about how far they'd come. From that desperate day in Morrison's general store, when Grace had been dying and Ethan had been the only person brave enough or broken enough to care. From a marriage of convenience to a love that defied all the odds stacked against it. What are you thinking? Ethan asked, his lips brushing her temple. I'm thinking about 7 cents, Sarah said. About how that's all I had left when you walked into my life. 7 cents and a dying daughter and no hope left anywhere. And now? Now I have everything. Sarah's voice was fierce with certainty. I have you. I have Grace and Thomas. I have a home and a future and a love I never thought I'd find. All because one broken man saw another person's desperation and chose to help instead of looking away. I'm not the only one who made that choice, Ethan said. You chose to trust me, to come with me, to build a life with a stranger living among ghosts. You chose to love me despite everything, the grief, the fear, the baggage I carried. We chose each other, Sarah corrected. And we keep choosing each other every single day. Grace's laughter rang out across the yard as the mayor nuzzled her hand. Thomas stirred against Sarah's shoulder, making the small sounds that meant he'd wake soon, hungry and demanding. And Ethan stood solid and real beside her, his presence a promise that she'd never face anything alone again. This was their family. Imperfect, unconventional, built from broken pieces and desperate choices. But it was real. And it was theirs. And it was everything Sarah had ever hoped for, and more than she'd dared to dream. The sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed and horses whinnied. The prairie grass rippled like waves in the evening breeze, and the Mallory family stood together on their porch, surrounded by love hard-won and fiercely protected. "I love you," Sarah said, the words as natural as breathing now. "I love you too," Ethan replied. "All of you. My whole heart, my whole life, my whole world." Grace came running back, her face flushed with excitement, already chattering about names for the mayor and when she could ride and could Papa teach her today. Please, please, please. Thomas woke with a cry, demanding food and attention with the imperious nature of a 2-month-old. And Ethan laughed, that full, rich sound that still sometimes surprised Sarah with its joy. This was home. This was family. This was the life they'd built from nothing, from 7 cents and starvation and a lone rancher's tears. This was love, complicated, hard-won, absolutely real. And as the Kansas sunset painted everything gold, as her husband's arms came around her and her children filled the air with noise and life, Sarah Mallory knew with absolute certainty that every moment of struggle, every moment of fear, every desperate choice that had led her here, it had all been worth it. They had chosen love, and love had chosen them back.